Chapter 16. Kicking a Dog While He's Down. As wondrous a secret keeper he was, Master Capel did not seem keen to bank on Hermione's for the time being. No letter was sent to her, nor were any more threats issued. Whenever Hermione passed him, she saw that he was still ambling about with his permanent look of faint disgust. Each time he caught her staring, his sneer widened until she scurried away. But Hermione did not have time to think of him nowadays, for springtime had snuck up on her already. The sun shone brightly, and the corridors were now bearably draughty. Although the temperature of the corridors no longer mattered as much with such weather, students were now outside more than ever. Hermione was not one of the aforementioned students. No, when she had first heard talk of Easter holidays coming up, it had taken all of her willpower to not let out a terrified shriek. She had forgotten to start drawing up her revision schedule. Emil had not been sympathetic at all. "Hermione," he said, "it's still March. You do know that, right? Or are you just so barking mad that you really think you need to start studying now? Come on, we can at least wait until Easter actually comes around." "Oh, it's still March," Hermione cried in a mocking tone. "And exams are when again?" "Oh, yes, June. Of course, that means we just sit on our hands for the few months we have. Just of course. Why don't we go on a broom ride, Emil?" "Ooh, that sounds fun, doesn't it? And why don't we just burn the library down while we're at it? Because we'll be expelled anyway for having the worst final marks in Durmstrang history, because we haven't been studying at all." He looked flatly at her. "Sometimes I wonder about you." Likewise, the teachers, thankfully, were miles more reasonable than Emil and her other peers. There was rarely a day where they were not assigned multiple feet of work in each class, along with even more optional supplementary work excelling students were offered. Although the library had always been a frequent haunt of Hermione's, it was now getting to the point she could rarely be found outside of it. By the second week of March, Emil realized something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong when Hermione arrived at breakfast with a roll of parchment so long it slid off the bench and pooled on the stone floor like a shed snakeskin. "I've optimized it," she said brightly, unrolling more. "Don't step on the section's color-coded gray. Those are provisional dependencies." "Those arrowhat, provisional dependencies," she began loftily, "are potential tasks for the future that mustn't be started on until the completion of another task. Don't think about them for now. In this case, for the wizardry subjects, I haven't started on a proper schedule for dueling or history. Sorry, I'd best digest more philosophical works and really ruminate on the conceptual meanings first, before researching all the specifics. I'll be consulting each professor on what exact material is best to read, of course, since they know loads more than I do." Emil opened his mouth, then closed it again as she warmed to her topic. "Then, it's obvious I'll have to systematically repeat this process for each related bit of magic before finally putting all the pieces together and really starting to see each spell or ritual family as a whole." She jabbed her fork at a column crammed with minuscule writing. "After that, we'll start going through the actual advanced literature, beginning with essentials like the Volkov papers and finishing off with, well, we'll never actually be ever finished, right?" Emil said weakly. "And when do you rest?" Hermione frowned. "If you're talking about sleep, there are time slots to do that every day. See, look at all those purple boxes. But if you're referring to the end of our structured study sessions, that's after synthesis, obviously. That's when everything gets rewritten, mapped, connected when the subjects stop being subjects and start being one system. It's dreadful and wonderful. Anyway," she added, finally taking a bite of tough toast, "you needn't worry, your schedule's much lighter than mine." "Misschedule." His smile was strained. "Wow, Hermione, yow, you really didn't have toy mean, really." "But it did," said Hermione, beaming. "You're welcome." Wisely, Emil did not point out that he had never said thank you. Later, when Astrid left Liv and Sophia to join them, and Hermione handed the other girl her own roll of parchment, she was much more vocal about it. "Are you mad?" Astrid demanded, so loud that a herring was thrown at her from across the table. She yelped and dodged before going on, "Sorry, Hermione, but there's no way I'm doing this. I have this thing called a life and a boyfriend." she sighed dreamily. A boyfriend? By the Norns, I can hardly believe it. Larling's my darling, she furiously giggled. At Emil and Hermione's weary looks, Astrid pouted. Oh, come on, you two just don't understand. But you will one day, when you're in love, weary third years, Hermione told her. We've got a ways to go before falling in love. Exams, for one. Now that I'm thinking about it, this is a great example of what I was talking to Emil about before, a provisional dependency. Emil brightened. Did you include that in the timetable? If you're looking for love, go after Ivana, said Astrid. She was pointing far down the third-year table to a blubbering redhead. She's really sweet, you know. Love her. It's so awful how that terrible boy you room with broke up with her. If it were a boy, I'd definitely want her. Last week, you were saying her thoughts arrive late and leave early, Hermione whispered disapprovingly. Changed your mind already, have you? Of course not. But that's the ideal girl, isn't it? Sweet and dumb. And she's crying over her last boyfriend now, so she's vulnerable too. I swear, she'll be so easy to manipulate, it's almost funny. This is like a gazelle bleeding out in front of a pack of lions. Quick, Emil, go up to her and offer to cast a dry eyes charm. For many moments, Emil gaped at Astrid. Before he could say something, though, Ren had already slid into the seat beside Ivana. They watched as he spoke with peculiar kindness to her, before withdrawing his wand and casting the dry eyes charm, her tears glittering away at once. Ivana ducked her head, blushing. Astrid sighed loudly. Next time, maybe just listen to me. But as time crawled on up to and even past Easter break, it was getting progressively harder to do so. Astrid had never been a particularly varied girl, but her constant talk of love and Lars was wearing on Hermione greatly. Before, that been reserved for natural magic classes, as Master Thalberg waxed poetically of how each ingredient of the elixir of joy spiritually mimicked each necessary component to psychological fulfillment, or some such. Now, there was nary a day that passed without mention of her new boyfriend. It had pleased Hermione that Astrid had the tact to not touch the topic of him much when around Emil. It had pleased Hermione much less that she was the recipient of Lars talk in his stead. But Liv and Sophia always have the same opinions as me, Astrid had protested when Hermione expressed this sentiment. I told you I need an Emil. I can't get inside Lars' head, but you're a bit more bish. Well, not bish. Personally, I think you transcend gender. You're just so wise and amazing and great. If I could, I'd make an idol of you and worship it every day. In fact, think of me telling you about Lars as my version of a prayer. Talking about him is already a very religious experience to me. Oh, please, Hermione, just let me tell you about what he did just now, so I can decide whether he deserves a good stoning or a good kiss, or needless to say, between relentless exam preparation and Astrid's ceaseless prattle, Hermione's days were rarely her own. Charm's class, at least, offered a certain measure of calm, for Hermione was excelling more than ever there. With the spring term came a new focus, advanced movement charms. They had studied rudimentary examples in earlier years, but these were of an entirely different order. Most Durmstrang students arrived already knowing the levitation charm. Admission itself all but required it. Levitation was simple enough, a direct manipulation of motion, flight imposed by sheer force of will. The locomotion charm, taught later, went a step further, animating objects as though they possessed an inner source of movement. It was an illusion. Of course, only transfiguration could truly alter an object's nature, but even so, the charm impressed intention onto matter, imitating mind without becoming mind itself. The charms they now confronted: the slowing charm, the ascending charm, the summoning charm, and more operated on a deeper principle. Rather than creating motion, they interfered with already present natural motion and place. To slow something was not merely to reduce speed, but to intervene in how motion unfolded, stretching its realization across time. And summoning was more complex still. It redefined motion itself, privileging relation over trajectory, insisting that an object belonged her with the caster. To alter an object's sense of place so absolutely was no small thing, and endlessly fascinating to Hermione, who had included many readings on relational magic on her to-do list as a result. She had even gotten a heavy doorstopper on the portkey spell, and many reference books too. The tome was clearly meant for those with a much wider breadth of knowledge. Hermione read until the high chime tolled and the library emptied. After several moments spent on trying to stuff her bag full of her many books, Hermione made her way to Charms. Mistress Merle's classroom was never quite still. Pale globes of light drifted near the ceiling like lost thoughts. Chalk diagrams erased and withdrew themselves when no one was looking. The grey-haired woman herself permanently looked as though she'd once walked into the room and forgotten to leave, and she lectured as if thinking aloud rather than to her students. Because momentum, she was saying, pacing in a loose spiral, is not speed, it's commitment. Motion is an agreement an object makes with its future. The slowing charm is not a simple break, it's a hesitation. You are persuading the object that perhaps it doesn't need to arrive quite yet. And agreements, Mistress Merle continued, can be renegotiated, or footnoted, or contradicted by later editions. On that topic, have any of you read Neotara on causality? No, no, don't answer. I can see from your faces that you haven't. Ooh, I have, cried Hermione eagerly, practically bouncing in her seat as she waved her hand in the air. It was a wonderful read, Professor, and it really made me understand loads more about the magical mechanics of motion. That bit about the aspect of Mercury, indirectly infusing all movement spells, really recontextualized the whole subject to me. But I was a bit frustrated with the repeated mentions of the principles of Perseus. I couldn't find a single book about what they actually were. Merle froze so suddenly that, for a moment, Hermione had thought she was hit with a freezing charm. Oh, Nyatara, she said with fond surprise. Yes, yes, dreadful man, absolutely dreadful, wrote like he was being paid by the subordinate clause. Still, very clever indeed. And the principles of Perseus, oh, dear me, did I forget to tell you to check out here be hubris. It's to do with the higher order statements necessary to more complex movement magic. The first law is to do with the sort of magic that can change something's natural place at all. Hermione let out a squeal of delight. Well, that's obviously for spells that Volkov's standard model don't apply to, she said, leaning forward. I'm right, aren't I? I haven't had the chance to read his later commentaries, but I've been going through both Karkov's deferred motion and Sorensen's mercurial frames, so I can sort of reconstruct the idea that, yes, yes, exactly, Mistress Merle said happily, waving a hand. A triangulation. Motion as vow, motion as vector, motion as myth. Perseus didn't move. You see, he was moved for. Direction as destiny. It's all very what was that dreadful little pamphlet, The Arrow That Refused the Target anyway? Emil had begun staring fixedly at his desk, cheeks pink. He tugged lightly at Hermione's sleeve. Hermione, he murmured, maybe do this later. People want to get into the actual spellcasting. This was true. All around the class, there were eye twitches and looks of annoyance all abound, and all aimed at Hermione. Even Conrad, whose sharp-featured face was rarely not blank, was grinding his teeth. Nevertheless, Hermione ignored Emil. The arrow that refused the target, asked Hermione. This is such a coincidence. I was reading that all the way back in Christmas break. Goodness, that old model pre-unification, terribly unfashionable, that treats motion as a form of storytelling, with beginnings, middles, and endings, and the slowing and freezing charms metaphorically interrupting the plot. The projectile expects a climax, and you just in it resolution. That was nothing but wonderful. Several classmates rolled their eyes in near-perfect unison, but Merle beamed back at her. Oh, IQ, she said. And I'm not even the type to pick favorites. I hate most of my students equally, she laughed loudly. But enough talking. Talking is a kind of motion too, and we've quite overindulged. Time to practice. With a flick of her wand, a small box burst open at the front of the room, disgorging a flurry of grey and white feathers that drifted lazily down onto each desk. "Remember, arresto momentum," exclaimed Merle, already wandering away. Drop the feather and persuade it otherwise. All around her, chairs scraped back and wands came up at once. "Arresto momentum," rang out in a dozen voices. Most of the feathers responded by doing exactly what feathers had always done. They fell. Not a single feather had not drifted to its respective desk. A few wobbled uncertainly, as though briefly considering disobedience, before surrendering to gravity and even quicker than before. There was a faint thwack as Ivan Petrov's feather shot sideways and slapped itself against Emil's cheek. "Sorry," Ivan said, far too late. He grinned, adding, "At least it didn't go up your nose, huh?" As always with his jokes, nobody laughed. But then there was a giggle in the row behind them. Hermione looked behind her to find Astrid and Liv's blonde heads ducked together, both bobbing with mocking laughter. Hermione's nostrils flared, but she resolved to confront the two later. "Don't push it," she said firmly to Ivan, not casting yet. "You're arguing with it. That never works. You have to know, not like that, think of the moment between moments. The way you're doing it now's just all wrong." "Thanks for the advice, Morgenstern," he said, giving her an odd sort of smile before going back to what he was doing before. It still did not work. Beside Hermione, Emil tried the spell, brow furrowed, feather fluttering to the desk mockingly. "Well, I'm thinking of the moment between moments," he hissed. "Turns out it's very empty." "That's because you're skipping the commitment phase," said Hermione briskly. She leaned over, tapping his wrist with her finger. "Your wand motion's too decisive. Slow yourself down first," Emil sighed. "So the feather cares about my emotional journey. Hermione, I don't even care about my own emotional journey." Hermione shot him a look. "It does, actually. If you're going to be flippant, at least be curatorly flippant." "I'm not flippant," said Emil. "I'm depressed." "Emil, you mustn't make jokes like that." "And if that's not a joke, then you really ought to go to Healer. Frisk soon exams are coming up, remember? And I was reading this paper on how mindset affects magic. Arresto momentum," cried Astrid from the row behind. Her feather slowed to an almost halt midair, then promptly began spinning like a deranged compass needle and shot straight upward, embedding itself in one of the drifting light globes with a faint pop. Mistress Merle clapped delightedly. "Oh, excellent. A lateral hesitation with vertical enthusiasm. Very rare combination." Astrid flushed, half with pride, half with panic. Is it supposed to be on fire?" The light globe fizzled ominously. "Let it express itself," Merle said serenely. Across the room, Conrad had not cast a single spell yet. He sat perfectly still, wand angled with precise economy, eyes half-lidded. When he finally spoke, it was almost too soft to hear. Arresto momentum. His feather slowed, its descent stretching out as though time itself had thickened around it. It sank after many long moments with stately inevitability. Merle drifted closer, humming. "Ah," she said. "There it is. Very good, Mr. von Eisenwald." Suddenly, any desire to help Emil further dissipated. She picked up her own feather and dropped it as she waved her wand, incanting, "Arresto momentum." The quill slowed as if passing through invisible syrup, its momentum sapped until, just above the desk, it froze. It was a particularly tricky casting of the spell, more of an enchantment than anything, given that the momentum was being continuously robbed before gravity could take hold. But Mistress Merle would not be impressed with just that, not from her most prized student. And so, with a wave of her wand, she ended the spell before trying once more. This time, she stole only its linear momentum yet conserved its angular momentum. It froze its descent momentarily, but continued to rotate, fluttering lazily on its axis. A moment later, it was falling yet again. A murmur rippled through the class. Hermione frowned slightly and waved her wand again. The air around the feather seemed to ripple, with a faint distortion appearing like heat above stone. Once the feather entered it, it slowed further, but not uniformly. Its barbs sagged at different rates. the tip dipping while the shaft lagged behind, as though the feather were being translated through several slightly disagreeing versions of time. With another precise movement of her wand, the air was normal again, and the feather began to sink downward, still rotating, still otherwise fixed in place, selectively suppressing forward motion while permitting vertical acceleration, she said eagerly to Emil. Gravity counts as a separate influence, so unless you explicitly argue against that like I was doing before, the object is quite happy to fall. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, Mistress Merle, it's a bit like the lazy river model from Flow Charms. Merle let out an interested hum as she wandered over. Yes, rivers, or treacle like you Brits have, or time in a waiting room, she said, waving her wand about. Oh, do go on, dear. I was thinking of Zeno myself, not Flow Charms, but I'd just be delighted to hear more. And so, for the rest of the class, Hermione eagerly babbled to Merle as the rest of the class attempted to cast the spell. Intermittently, Merle would give Hermione more to do with the spell, and there was not a single thing she could not do. From slowing throne books to fallen desks to even animated quills, all with a heavyweight charm cast upon them, Hermione did not blink. She just did. She caught Conrad glancing at her more than once, and each time she gave him a small smile. One could perhaps argue it was a smirk, but Hermione herself would never use such a word to describe it. Her days fell into a rhythm that bordered on the punishing. Entire evenings were swallowed whole by study sessions that stretched until her eyes ached, and the letters on the page began to swim. She stayed buried in books far into the night, devouring magical theories and laws with a ferocity that no other could match. Emil was with her for much of it, pale and increasingly hollow-eyed, but stubbornly present. April crawled on. Any remaining snow retreated from the cliffs. Meltwater thundered through hidden channels in the rock. Hermione revised, cross-revised, rewrote, and synthesized until she had to owl-order even more parchment scrolls to fill up. Somewhere along the way, the studying stopped feeling like preparation and began to feel like listening. When returning to the wind charm, for one, Emil was focused on controlling his neat, controlled burst. Hermione's wand had traced a softer arc, less forceful than recommended, and the air answered her anyway. Not a shove, but a breath that grew into a steady gale, curling obediently around the abandoned classroom, lifting desks, drifting parchments into neat stacks, and spinning fallen quills back into ink pots. And with only a thought, the wind could bend, part, retreat, whatever she commanded it to do. Emil watched from behind his book, eyebrows creeping steadily higher. And with compulsion curses, Hermione had, after much urging from Emil, finally decided to try out a few. She had proved frighteningly competent in them, to the extent that she and Emil still did not discuss the aftermath of the enchantment she'd placed upon him while practicing. Transfiguration followed the same pattern. By this time, other students labored over kittens, whispering reassurances and double-checking diagrams, counting wand motions under their breath. Even Conrad had to consult Master Capel whenever given a novel transfiguration not included in the textbook. Hermione watched them with frustrated exasperation. She wanted to offer help outright, but Emil had once again begged her not to, then looked to Emil. Her eyes lit up when she saw his dowel had already sprouted a furry tail and whiskers. "You're almost there. I didn't know you've been improving so much. It's hard not to when I've spent weeks with you," he said, huffing a laugh. "I swear, having you as a study buddy is a cruel fate." He glanced at the hefty lynx she'd transfigured. It was prowling the area nearby. "Well," Hermione began tentatively, "you could always spend a bit more time without me. Astrid told me that you're not talking to her much nowadays, you know." Emil's jaw tightened. "She's imagining things. I talk to her just as much as before, which was never all that much. The only time Astrid cared about talking to me was when she hated you, and studying is important." "Do you want me to fail?" He smiled slightly. "Want to burn down the library together already?" Hermione smiled too, but before she could urge him once again to speak to Astrid more, he spoke quickly. Why don't you focus more on transfiguration? Yeah. Can't risk stumbling during the exam. Come on, try a bit of a challenge. How about transfigure your desk in tow or so? Her eyebrows shot up. Yet she still drew her wand. The sow and the desk were both four-legged, stable, and mostly stationary. More so, both were vessels of transformation. As the sow gestates life, the desk incubates meaning, receiving chaotic thought and unformed intention, yet crystallizing into something focused through stillness and containment. Theories she'd memorized months ago unfolded all at once, no longer stacked neatly in separate chapters, but woven together into a single, intuitive understanding. Her wand moved before she consciously decided how it should, a smooth sequence that felt inevitable. In a process that took many minutes, wood flowed, reshaped, sighed into flesh and warmth, and a disgruntled sow blinked up at her, snuffling indignantly at the stone floor. All around the class, whispers rippled, and people craned their necks to see the sight. As was becoming a more common sight than ever, Conrad's eyes were narrowed. Emil stared. "I thought I was setting you up for failure," he sighed. "Do you even know what that is?" "A thing that happens to those who don't work hard enough," said Hermione, with a haughty sniff that was only half joking. It became a game between them after that. Emil would produce an object at random, a teacup, an armchair, a bronze candelabra, and Hermione would transform it without asking for clarification, her wand finding the correct rhythm as if guided by instinct rather than instruction. Sometimes she surprised even herself, a glass bottle becoming a sleek otter, a stack of parchment scrolls unfolding into a flutter of sparrows. When it went wrong, it failed interestingly, at least, teaching her more in a minute than hours of careful rehearsal ever had. She did not see Astrid much herself until, one day, Astrid insisted, with all the fervor of a prophet announcing revelation, that Hermione had to come up to the North Tower with her, Liv, and Sophia before dark arts. Something about news. Hermione had suspected correctly that the news was Lars-shaped. Astrid and Liv's dormitory was nothing like Hermione and Iva's spare, monkish quarters. The space was warm and softly cluttered. There were knitted throws draped over the ends of their beds, and half-burned, scented candles perched all upon the windowsill. A vanity near the wall was quite crowded and had a rather mean mirror. It had shrieked upon seeing Hermione. There were books, two mysteries, spellcraft manuals, a dog-eared volume on beauty charms, but stacked sideways or tucked under pillows rather than in neat piles. Liv lounged cross-legged on her bed, braiding a strand of her hair. Sophia sat at the desk, listening with rapt attention as Astrid paced back and forth, practically vibrating. "It's the fourth date," said Astrid for perhaps the fifth time, hands clasped to her chest. "Fourth." That's when it stops being tentative and starts being, well, not serious, obviously, but meaningful. We were going to walk by the cliffs and then maybe sneak into the kitchens, and then, oh, she squealed suddenly. "Do you think he'll bring flowers?" Fourth dates feel like flower territory. Honestly, first dates are prime flower territory, and where were they then? Sophia asked, looking around in mock confusion. "Lars better step up his game. He's really been lackingy mean. He took you to a play last time. What's that supposed to mean?" "Who even likes those things? Losers. So either he's saying you're a loser or that you're dating a loser. Either way, automatic breakup, in my opinion. You're too forgiving." "I like plays," Astrid said, frowning. Beauty was thinking that maybe he took me there as a subtle attack. Because he said that was his favorite date, and obviously I couldn't speak for most of the play, since it's just classless to do that. So he basically was telling me he likes me only when I shut up, wasn't he? That my voice is worse than a banshee's. Hermione, who was awkwardly perched on the edge of Astrid's bed, cleared her throat. "Astrid, I really think you're thinking too deeply. I haven't heard much of going to plays for dates, but I've heard of going to a movie theater." "Movie?" asked Liv dubiously. "Sort of like a recorded Muggle play," she explained quickly. "Anyway, Muggles go there sometimes for dates, and I assume it's because it's a built-in conversation starter mostly. You and he did go out for ice cream after, so it wasn't as if there was no talking at all. And there's loads off build up, isn't there? Wondering whether to hold hands or not, brushing arms the works. At once, Astrid's face softened. Oh, he's such a romantic. By God, he really was thinking all of that, wasn't he? Before Hermione had time to even roll her eyes, there was a knock at the door. Astrid froze. Then she sprinted to answer it, nearly tripping over a discarded shoe. Lars stood in the doorway, looking faintly alarmed by the collective attention of 4 girls turning on him at once. "Hello," he said, nodding awkwardly at each of them in turn. "Hermione, Liv, Sophia." There was a pause. "Astrid," she beamed at him with a brightness that made the sun look dim. Lars continued, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to say I won't be able to make it tonight." "The date, I mean." Astrid's smile faltered just slightly. "My cousin Alma's in the hospital wing," he said quickly. "A couple of students claimed she said something pro-Grindelwald. It's nonsense, obviously, but it turned ugly. You know the way people get about that topic." "Oh," Astrid said softly. She stepped closer, taking his hands without hesitation. "Lars, that's awful. Of course you should be with her." She gave him a kiss upon the cheek. "Tell Alma that I hope she gets better soon. I have class soon, but as soon as I'm out, I'll come visit. Why are you nervous? It's just a 4th date." "Go." When he'd gone, the door clicking softly shut behind him, Astrid whirled around at once, fists clenched. "It's just a 1st date," she burst out. "Does that good-for-nothing wimp know how important that is?" Astrid's ensuing rant was long, detailed, and circular, involving cousin conspiracies, Grindelwald sympathizers. What sensible Scandinavian cares about Grindelwald? He didn't even invade us. But that bint wants to act like she's the next Grindelwald. Then I'm Dumbledore, because I'll be the one to really end her reign of terror once and for all. And by reign of terror, I mean her life. And at least 3 contradictory declarations of how mature she was being about the whole thing. By the time they finally left the dormitory and headed down the corridor toward dark arts, Hermione's head ached more than it had after any study session. They rounded the corner near the lower stairwell and stopped. Peter Wren had Emil backed against the wall. The stocky boy's hand was braced beside Emil's head, the other toyed lazily with his wand. Emil's face was pale, and he was looking away. "What's wrong?" Wren was saying softly. "Cat got your tongue." "Oh, don't go silent on me now when you were being so mouthy before." Rage, so hot it was boiling, bubbled within Hermione, and before she knew it, she was racing to the scene. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Wren turned his head slowly, like a predator mildly inconvenienced by noise. His pale eyes flicked over Hermione, dismissive, then back to Emil. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Just a private conversation," he said. "Run along now." Emil's shoulders were rigid. His fingers twitched once at his side, as though he were fighting the urge to reach for his wand. Hermione stepped closer, planting herself squarely between them. Neither boy was particularly tall, but she was still shorter than both. "Just listen to him," Emil gritted out, but she ignored him entirely. "You don't get private conversations like this," she said, gesturing pointedly at the wand inches from Emil's chest. "So, and I'll only repeat this once, why don't you run along now? Cute," drawled Wren. "I was wondering when you'd start speaking for him. Figures, really. For him," Hermione snapped. "I'm speaking at you. Leave him alone." "He's always been pathetic," Wren said conversationally, smiling. "Always lurking on the edges like he hoped no one would notice him enough to squash him." He tilted his head. "But I'll admit he did at least have standards." Behind Hermione, Emil flinched. Wren's smile widened. One of the few decent things about Emil was that he was never a blood traitor. Never embarrassed himself by groveling to filth just to feel important, turning himself into a loyal little mutt for a filthy half-blood. In a flash, Hermione's wand was out, but Wren's painfully jabbed against her stomach. Before either could break free from the standstill, "Peter," came Astrid's chiding voice. "Really, intimidating Emil's one thing, but you'd seriously hurt a girl." "Yes," said Wren, snorting. Astrid sighed. "I suppose that was a dumb question." I just didn't want to have to go the stereotypical route of if you hurt her, we'll all draw our wands and you'll be hexed into a puddle. It's all so overdone, isn't it? Ren's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked over the lot of them, then he lowered his wand. He rolled his eyes. I'll be a gentleman and save you from being cliché. His mouth twisted as he looked at Emil one last time. Try not to choke on her leash. He shoved off the wall and stalked away, boots echoing sharply down the corridor. Silence rushed in to replace him. Hermione lowered her wand slowly, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She turned at once to Emil. Are you all right? She demanded. What happened? What did you say to him? What did you say to him? Why was he Emil? Emil was already moving away. Nothing, he said shortly. He didn't look at her. I didn't say anything. Emil, wait, I'll see you in dark arts, he added, voice tight. I'm taking the long way. And then he was gone, slipping down a side corridor without another word. Astrid clicked her tongue. Boys, she said dismissively. So dramatic. He can just get revenge on Rehan later if he can't beat him in a fight. I was thinking about poisoning his pixie tea. For one, it took everything within Hermione to not round on the other girl. Astrid, she gritted out, perhaps have some sympathy. He's your friend. For a moment, Astrid went silent. Then she leaned forth, whispering, just go after him, won't you? He wouldn't want me to do it. The boy barely talks to me as is. She said the last part quite sourly, and Hermione wanted to comfort her. But rather than speak, Hermione was already racing to Emil. She caught up with him halfway to the classroom, her stride quick, her voice relentless. Emil, you can't just walk away like that. What did Rehan mean? You were getting mouthy. What happened? And don't tell me nothing, because he doesn't corner people over nothing. Emil said nothing, his pace brisk. You've nothing to be ashamed of, Hermione pressed, breathless now. I'm not saying it's your fault, I just want to understand. Is he bullying you? If he is, you need to tell a teacher. A laugh burst from Emil as he walked on. Tell a teacher. God, what school do you think this is? Beauxbatons. What do you think will also have a heart-to-heart where they tell me I'm not weak, I'm brave and strong because I got help? And maybe, just maybe, they'll also make a support group for all victims where we recover from our deep trauma together. He laughed once again. Threatening other students is still against the rules here. And I've seen past detention records, so I know people still get reported. That's only when the teacher sees it, Emil sighed. It's rare, Hermione, and I'm not being bullied. Rehan just. He's never liked me much. That's all. Before Hermione could argue more, they'd already reached the dark arts classroom. Emil entered quickly, choosing a seat near the back, and Hermione went to the adjacent desk at once. If you won't tell, she said, I will. I'm sure Mistress Varric wouldn't hesitate to step in. She had, after all, gone against Capel on Hermione's behalf before she'd stopped. No, whispered Emil, his eyes wide. Please, Hermione, don't do that. Going to a professor is going to result, perhaps, in a lashing for Rehan. Then he'll hate me more, and actually bully me. And it'll also give me a reputation. It makes me look weak. And taking Rehan's taunts like a good little victim makes you look real enough, Emil. I'm positively terrified of you. It was a tense class after. Emil did not make his usual whispering commentary. Hermione would shush as Varric lectured upon the topic of the Nixie. Hermione's quill scratched furiously as she wrote. The Nix were shape-shifting creatures who, in many cases, lured victims by way of enchanted music or pleasing form to water in order to drown them. They were thought to be male, as any living being they imitated could never be female. Now, said Varric, with a usual slight smile, say you run into a Nixie. What then? Rehan's hand shot up before anybody else's, and when Varric inclined her head to him, he said, if they're inhabiting a pond, I'd say a draft charm, Professor. At his reedy voice, Hermione felt her eyes narrow. Good answer, Varric said approvingly. Anyone else? There were many answers then. Charms to boil the water, severing curses aimed at their necks, if in animal form. A few students suggested a nightmare hex delivered from a safe distance. One boy near the windows proposed transfiguring the Nixie itself into something less aquatic. which earned a ripple of laughter. Varric nodded to each contribution with the same mild attentiveness, as though filing them away. Conrad von Eisenwald spoke last. "A Nixie's greatest advantage is control of terrain," he said smoothly. "Remove that, and the rest becomes trivial. I would recommend collapsing the bank's inward mud and stone, both so the water fouls itself. Such impurities weaken their song." Mistress Varric hummed and nodded, and he turned to look at Hermione, for some reason, smiling. Conrad had developed an annoying habit of doing so in every class. At once, Hermione's own hand shot up. "Yes, Miss Morgenstern," Varric said. "You never specified that the Nixie was attacking us," she said. "Only that we came across one." A low, incredulous laugh came from somewhere behind her. "Nixie are sapient beings," Hermione went on, ignoring it. "Many are territorial, yes, but most do not attack humans unprovoked. Some have even taught wizards their magical music. So, to answer your question, if I came across a Nixie, I'd likely just go on with my day. And if they wanted to approach me, communication should be the first response. To treat mere contact as justification for violence is," she searched for the word, found it, and did not soften it, "abhorrent." Someone scoffed outright this time. Of course, if a Nixie becomes violent, then force may be necessary. You could freeze the water source, cast a compulsion curse upon it, even ignite it if containment fails. But violence should not be the instinct. It should always be the last resort. I, for one, think that your framing is why certain people in this school are the way that they are." The room buzzed unpleasantly. A girl near the aisle muttered something about bleeding hearts. Rehan laughed under his breath. Emil rolled his eyes. Varric, however, smiled. "Excellent," she said. The class stilled, caught wrong-footed. Varric turned fully toward Hermione now, her expression thoughtful rather than indulgent. "Dark magic requires its practitioner to enter particular states of mind: anger, hatred, fear. Prolonged exposure has a tendency to make violence feel intuitive. Convenient, even righteous." Her gaze swept the room. "That is precisely why one must be cautious. If your first instinct is always destruction, you will eventually find reasons to destroy." A collective groan rose from the desks, long and theatrical. "Yes, yes," Varric said lightly. "Spare me the faces. You find morality tedious, coming from a mistress of the dark arts. The irony is not lost on me. That being said, we are done with Nixie for today." She flicked her wand, and the chalkboard wiped itself clean. "Now, on to your final examination. There will be a theoretical portion, as usual. The practical portion, however, will be held in the mountains." That got their attention. Many students straightened up and quieted. "Each of you will face an individualized scenario. There will be no partners, no advanced knowledge. You will be judged on skill, speed, and nerve. And that," Varric finished, "is all. You are dismissed." As they filed out, a torrent of talk flew about, students speculating loudly and badly about what horrors awaited them in the mountains. Hermione lingered behind, and so did Emil. He was looking at her warningly. With a tutting sort of sound, Hermione finally brushed past him. She did not want to risk him being right, and there being retaliation afterwards, despite how much she doubted him. Hermione spent most of the weekend alone, if one discounted the company of books which, by Sunday afternoon, she very nearly did not. She read as though pursued. Advanced treatises on Musica Universalis lay stacked beside her like a half-built wall, their margins bristling with cramped notes and argumentative arrows, while pause-state transfiguration manuals sprawled open in her lap. The theory was dense enough to make her eyes sting. Discussions of sympathetic harmonics between spellwork and planetary motion, footnotes that argued with one another across centuries, entire chapters devoted to the dangers of suspending an object between forms for too long. She devoured it all still, forgetting both meals and sleep in her pursuit. It was halfway through a particularly abstruse passage on harmonic convergence, something about the will of Mars being necessary for ion transformations, that Emil appeared at her table. She noticed him only because his shadow fell across the page. "What?" she said at once, sharp and unwelcoming, without looking up. Do you want? Emil winced, already rubbing the back of his neck in that way he had. Hermione, I'm just checking up on you. You haven't been to lunch at all, HMPH. Hermione flipped a page in her book. You could have talked to me at breakfast, or were you too busy giggling with Ivan Petrov, or perhaps getting brutalized by Ran? Who knows, it's not like you tell me anything. Well, yeah, not when it's none of your business, he said, rolling his eyes. Hermione whirled around, her bushy hair flying. How is it none of my business? We're friends, and you can't tell me that Rehan cornering you isn't my business when it is. Emil sighed, pulling out the chair opposite her and sitting anyway, as though bracing himself for a storm he'd already decided to endure. Hermione, please, I'm fine. People are hexed in the halls all the time. I thought you got over your soft-heartedness. I don't mean to be mean, but it's getting a bit old. That's not an argument, she retorted. That's just turning it around on me to avoid the real problem, and you are being stubborn. He huffed a short laugh. Mind your wand work before judging another's spell. I am stubborn because I care, she shot back. You think I enjoy this? You think I like chasing after you down corridors, trying to drag information out of you like I'm interrogating a prisoner? I don't. But I will not just sit quietly while someone decides you're an acceptable target. Emil looked away, jaw tightening. You don't understand? Then explain it to me. Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn string. Emil stared at the tabletop, fingers drumming once, then stilling. Hermione, he said at last, quietly now, please, just drop it. She opened her mouth at once, a dozen arguments already surging forward, but she stopped. The look on his face was not angry, exactly, but brittle, as though one more push might fracture something that would not easily be put back together. And suddenly, the thought of him shutting her out entirely felt worse than the injustice burning in her chest. Her shoulders stiffened. Slowly, she nodded. Fine, she said, far more tightly than she meant to. I'll drop it. Emil let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like relief. He smiled, small and genuine, as though he'd just won a battle he hadn't been sure he could fight. Thank you, I'll drop it, she thought, with grim resolve. For now, there were better times for confrontation, safer ones. She would bring it up again later when he wasn't so emotional. Apparently satisfied, Emil stood. In the spirit of listening, he said lightly, you're coming with me. She glanced up suspiciously. Coming where? The cave of listening. Hermione snorted before she could stop herself. You're obsessed with that place, she said. It's a cave, Emil. It echoes. Yes, very nifty. I was impressed the first 3 times. He said, entirely unbothered. You were also impressed by Quidditch once. You've grown jaded. I've grown busy, she responded, gesturing pointedly at the mountainous pile of books beside her. I've got loads of work to do before exams. And some of us think you're going to transfigure yourself into dust if you don't step outside, said Emil, who was already backing away and jerking his head toward the exit. Come on, 10 minutes. You can even bring the book if it makes you feel better. She hesitated, glaring at him, then at the page she had been struggling to pass for several minutes. Oh, fine, she said, reluctantly gathering her things. But if I forget some critical transformation correspondence because of this, I'm blaming you, Emil grinned. I'll live. Despite her exaggerated annoyance, Hermione followed him out of the library and toward the long, winding path that led across the steep cliff. The sky was cloudless and bright blue, and the breeze off the lake was sharp but pleasant. As they walked into the mountains, 2 great walls of stone closing them in, Hermione grumbled, Honestly, Emil, I really don't get why you like this place so much. If it's just for the quiet, the library's just as good, even better, considering the lack of constant echoing. It's fun. Just then, the path widened to the plateau before the vast rock mouth of the cave, a sheet of water cascading down. Scarpa, whispered Hermione, and the water bent to the side, creating an opening for them to pass into. A soft hum surrounded them at once as they breached the cave. A less trained ear would hear nothing, but by now Hermione could faintly pick up echoes of her and Emil's past conversations here. Their boots splashed softly as they went inward, the shallow pool licking at the edges of the rock like a patient thing. At first, the water barely skimmed Hermione's soles, cold enough to be irritating, but not enough to warrant comment. Further in, the ceiling dipped and the walls pressed closer, and the pool deepened, darkening. Hermione lifted the hem of her robes with a scowl. If this ruins my shoes, I'm deducting it from whatever goodwill you think you've earned. You have goodwill? Emil asked lightly. I thought you ran purely on righteous indignation and exam stress. She shot him a look. Careful, I might start lecturing. That would be new, he said solemnly. They waded on in companionable silence for a few steps, the echoes of their breathing overlapping and folding back on themselves. Hermione tilted her head, listening despite herself. So, she said, feigning casualness, are you still trying to hear Astrid's voice in here? Because, you know, that problem could be solved quite easily by perhaps talking to her more. Just an idea, of course. Emil grimaced. Her voice is quite nice, he conceded. It's the content that's the problem. If I have to hear one more dramatic retelling of how Lars smiled at her for precisely 3 seconds longer than usual, I may drown myself in this pool. There's always the possibility of redirecting the conversation. I tried, said Emil. She redirected it back. She's very talented. He paused, then added, though I was flipping through one of her magazines the other day, you know, the glossy ones with terrible advice, and I swear I saw someone who looked exactly like Lars on a Sweden's Most Wanted page. Hermione sighed. Emil, Lars is Norwegian. He stared at the water, processing this. Then his eyes widened. That makes it worse, he declared. He's an international criminal. Do you know what this might mean for the future of the Kalmar Union? The treaty's ripping itself as we speak. Hermione laughed outright then, the sound bouncing around the cave and coming back somehow fuller. You're impossible. Incorrect, he said. My mother didn't raise a fool. Oh, Hermione raised an eyebrow. What happened with your brothers then? He squawked something unintelligible and whirled around in exaggerated outrage, throwing his hands up, and his elbow clipped her arm. Hermione yelped as her footing slipped on the slick stone, and the next moment she was falling backward into the pool splash. By Tara, Hermione, Emil gasped, spinning back, already reaching for her. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. But it was too late, for Hermione surfaced with a sharp gasp, hair plastered to her face, robes clinging coldly, and with a look of pure, vindictive delight. She grabbed his sleeve with surprising strength and yanked. Emil let out a startled shout as he toppled forward. Splash! Water sloshed high against the rock, ripples racing outward as their laughter is surprised, and as triumphant layered over itself again and again, filling the cave of listening. You! Emil cut himself off with his own laughs. Hermione, I said sorry. The water was freezing, and Hermione had to swish from side to stay warm, even as she smirked at him. Well, sorry doesn't fix what you did. You're right, sighed Emil. I suppose I must make you a better apology. He scooped up a double handful of water and flung it at her. Hermione shrieked as the cold slapped against her face and collarbone. Emil, she yelped, sputtering, but she was laughing even as she said it, breathless and indignant. That was entirely uncalled for. Oh, I disagree, he said, already grinning, already retreating a step through the water. It felt very restorative. You looked far too smug. She narrowed her eyes at him, lips twitching despite herself. You are going to regret that. And then she splashed him back, harder, sending water arcing up and drenching his shoulders and hair. Emil let out an affronted noise and retaliated at once, and suddenly they were laughing and stumbling through freezing water, slipping and righting themselves, flinging wave after wave with reckless abandon. Hermione's earlier irritation dissolved completely, chased away by the sharp cold and the sound of Emil's laughter echoing back at them, brighter each time. Race you to the far wall, Emil called suddenly, already turning. Hermione did not bother answering. She lunged forward, robes clutched in one hand, legs burning as she kicked through the water. The cave rang with splashes and breathless exertion. Emil was longer-legged, But Hermione was far more stubborn. She surged ahead in the last stretch, slapped a hand against the rock first, and spun triumphantly. "I win," she said, panting, hair plastered to her cheeks. Emil splashed to a stop beside her, Mark glaring. "Unfair," he declared. "You cheated." "I did no such thing." "And how would I even cheat? You know compulsion charms," he said. "Probably messed with my mind to make me think I lost." They leaned there for a moment, catching their breath, the water lapping quietly now as if tired of their antics. Then Emil pushed off the wall, said, "Bet I can hold my breath longer than you," and dipped under suddenly. "Oh, as if," she muttered and dove after him. The world muffled at once, sound collapsing inward. The water was darker here, colder, pressing in on her ears and temples. Emil's blurred shape was nearby, his legs kicking lazily. She held her breath, counting without numbers, eyes fixed on the faint glow filtering down from above. And yet, after many moments, her lungs began to ache and burn. She waited a second longer, stubborn even here, and then pushed upward, breaking the surface with a sharp gasp. Air rushed in and pain followed it. A sharp pressure bloomed in her ear, disorienting, making her wince. Hermione lifted a hand to the side of her head, blinking rapidly as she tried to swallow it away. The echoes in the cave seemed to swell, overlapping and distorting, no longer merely reflections of sound, but something closer, nearer whispers. Hermione froze. They slid through the air and water alike, threading themselves straight into her skull. A sharp pain spiked through her skull, and she whimpered, clutching her temples instinctively. It was a white heart. Lancing sensation spots danced behind her. "Ice, you have walked through the fire," murmured a voice that was neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft. "You have seen what you will do for magic." A cry escaped from Hermione. The pain was too much, too hot, too you recognized your weakness. The voice continued, implacable, and you chose to cut it away. "Stop," she thought. "Stop, stop, stop." The pain spiked in response, bright and blinding, and tears escaped. "There is another task," the voice said. "You will go to the archives. Now, if you do not, your identity will be revealed. But if you do, your friend here will suffer the consequences instead." "Stop it," she thought pleadingly, forcing the question through the pain. "Stop it. Please, please don't make me choose. What will happen to him if I do? It will not be permanent. If Healer Frisk is even halfway competent, it will stop soon enough. Certainly before school is out of session. Before school was out of session, it was April. Emil would be going through months of pain. Because of her. All because of her. She could still hear the cave, still hear water shifting. "Ha!" Emil burst up beside her, whooping triumphantly. "I won, you surfaced first." But she did not answer. The pain had receded, replaced by the sound of her trembling breaths. Her decision had already settled, heavy and cold. She had done too much to earn her place here. She had spent an entire year working to angle her way in, lying to her parents where she'd been sneaking out to, scouring Diagon Alley for more information about the continent. She had remembered her cry of joy when finding that booth with an affiliated bookstore in Prussiamel would heal. She told herself fiercely. He would be fine, but she would not be if she did not flee now. Hermione hauled herself out of the pool, hands shaking as she scrambled onto the rock. "Wait, Hermione," Emil called, startled. "Where are you going?" I forgot something," she said quickly, the words tumbling over one another. "Something important. I have to go now." "I must, it's important, I'm sorry." "What now?" He splashed toward her. "You're soaked." She rushed past him, heart hammering. "Sorry," she called again as she ran out and hated herself for how much she meant it. Chapter 17. Seeing Red. Hermione was running. It was with a speed so ferocious it was as though the mountains themselves had loosed her like a stone flung from a slingshot, her boots slipping on loose shale, sodden cloak snapping behind her like a frightened thing struggling to escape. Breath tore in and out her chest, and tears streamed unchecked, torn loose by the wind and flung back over her shoulders, vanishing as quickly as they fell. She did not wipe them away. She did not slow. She could not. Her legs burned, each step sending a sharp protest through her bones, but she welcomed the pain. She deserved it. A narrow path twisted ahead, no wider than a cart's axle, clinging to the mountainside as though by stubbornness alone. She took it at a reckless pace, fingers barely brushing the rock wall for balance. By the time she reached the fortress gates, her lungs burned like they had been scraped raw. She tore inside, heedless of startled looks, her robes damp and clinging, and her hair coming loose from its plait. Corridors blurred past her in streaks of witchlight, and voices buzzed around her, but she did not have the luxury of waiting. She did not know what waited in the archives, only that she had been summoned. The library doors flew open under her hand, and she burst through, the sudden hush inside ringing louder than any shout. A light scent, one of parchment and old ink, closed around her, but did not offer any comfort. As she weaved and darted past tables and shelves, not slowing even a bit, all she could feel was the bile crawling up her throat finally. After many minutes of running through the library, she knew she was close. All chatter was dead, and the air aplomb with dust. Then Hermione saw it, the archives. She stopped dead. Parchment filled the space from floor to ceiling, not stacked or shelved, but moving, whirling, multiplying, beating against one another like a vast, pale swarm. Sheets peeled themselves into existence midair, unfurling with sharp, papery snaps before joining the cloud. There was a moment where Hermione simply paused, confused beyond belief. What was this? Why would Capel send her here? The papers moved too fast to get a good look at darting, colliding, veering away just as her eyes tried to focus. It was impossible to read anything whole, only fragments. A crest here, a date there, a blur of red that might have been ink or might have been a trick of the light. Yet, after casting a repelling charm upon the area, she ran to the swarm anyway. One sheet skimmed her shoulder, and another brushed her cheek like a slap. "Stop," she gasped, her hands grasping air. "Just slow down." Her fingers closed around a single page, crumpling it slightly as she tore it free of the current. The rest of the swarm grew in number and redoubled its frantic orbit, but Hermione barely noticed. Her eyes were already locked on what she held. It was her work. She knew it in the instant her gaze landed on the familiar writing, the lines precisely drawn, the seal she had practiced reproducing until her wrist ached. A her lineage chart creased now beneath her grip, but it was all wrong. Red ink slashed across it, vivid as blood. Seal variant postdates claimed registration by 6 years. Muggle maternal line entirely fabricated. Descent from a lineage wiped out in the war branch. Her breath left her in a sharp, broken sound. Capel was taunting her. He was showing her how he had found out she was Muggle-born, how he had marked up her carefully crafted papers. The paper ripped itself from her hand, wrenched away by the pull of the swarm, and as it vanished back into the storm, she let out a sob. It multiplied endlessly. The longer she stared, the faster they seemed to breed, an expanding, self-propagating cyclone of her own failure, circling and circling as though waiting to descend. "No," she breathed, the word tearing loose from her chest. "No, stop, Akio." She slashed her wand through the air, but nothing answered. The nearest document fluttered tantalizingly out of reach, then darted away again, untouched. Anti-theft charms her mind supplied numbly, even as panic surged. Of course he'd thought of that. Her breath hitched. Think, Imma Bolus," she cried, sending a freezing charm arcing into the swarm. Several sheets stiffened at once, but the mass simply flowed around them, carrying the frozen papers along like debris caught in a river. Hermione spun, heart hammering, casting again and again, each spell more frantic than the last, until her arm tired and the archive rang faintly with the sounds of frozen parchment colliding. But it wasn't enough. They kept coming, swelling around her. One dove forth, and she cried out as its edge sliced her cheek. Another came, and another, leaving shallow cuts in their wake. "Ventus," Hermione whimpered, and this time the wind answered, a sharp, spiraling gust that tore through the room and drove the papers back in a shrieking rush. For a moment she thought she had them, corralling the swarm into a single corner, but even as she fought to hold it, more documents bloomed into being, swelling the mass beyond her control. Her arms trembled, and her legs threatened to give way beneath her. Her thoughts skidded, fragmented, sliding between Emil's startled laugh and the red ink screaming and arresto momentum, she screamed. It was not a clean spell. It was not careful or precise or properly shaped. The charm burst from her wand in a raw, unfocused surge, driven more by desperation than discipline, and yet it struck true. The papers jerked mid-flight as though the world itself had thickened around them. Their mad circling slowed, then slowed again, until the entire swarm hung suspended in the air, quivering, the rate of their sickening multiplication stuttering. Hermione's eyes, widened. She had not known the slowing charm could affect other magic, and then finally ceasing altogether. Hermione sagged, gasping, surprise flickering only briefly through her terror. But she did not have time to marvel, and instead whispered, "Ventus." The wind obeyed her at once, gentler this time, drawing the immobilized papers together, folding them inward upon themselves. The cloud collapsed into a dense, shuddering mass. H. Reducio. And then the bundle shrank, parchment compressing and compressing, until it was no more than a small, ugly ball clenched tight in the air. Her jaw tightened, and with but a word, fire bloomed, quick and fierce. The paper vanished in a rush of flame and ash, heat licking her fingers before dying away. The ashes fell soundlessly to the stone floor. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Hermione turned and ran. She burst from the archive, through the library, past startled faces and shouted protests, her wet robe still clinging, her lungs still burning, her legs screaming with every step. There was no room left in her for fear now, only urgency so sharp it bordered on pain. Emil was alone, could be hurting because of her. She ran for the doors, bursting out. She ran, and did not slow. She ran until the fortress was but a distant memory, and the world narrowed to stone and sky and the punishing rhythm of her own breath. She ran the long, merciless path back into the mountains, feet striking rock, lungs tearing, heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might break free of her ribs entirely, and still she ran. By the time she reached the cave pool again, her hands were shaking so badly she could scarcely keep her balance. She staggered down toward the pool, half sliding on the slick stone. "Emmy," she screamed, the sound ripping itself raw from her throat. He lay crumpled where the water met the rock, his body twisted unnaturally, skin ashen and wrong. Dark veins crept up his neck like grasping fingers, stark against the pallor of his flesh. His moss-green eyes were open, but empty, fixed on nothing at all. The world tilted. Hermione dropped to her knees beside him, the strength fleeing her at last. The sobs came then, violent and unstoppable, tearing out of her chest as she reached for him with shaking hands. Emil did not wake. When Hermione had brought his limp form to the infirmary, still shaking and sobbing herself, Healer Frisk had taken one look at him and set to work without comment, as though this were merely another entry in a long ledger of Durmstrang mistakes. There had been no alarm raised, no questions asked. By the next day, the verdict among the school came quickly and comfortably. It had been an advanced dark magic attempt gone awry, an ambitious spell, poorly handled. This was a hardly unusual occurrence at Durmstrang, after all. Such was the nature of the dark arts. The only one who seemed to doubt this was Astrid. She had been distressed by the news, and disbelieving when Hermione had told her that she had just stumbled across Emil like that. "Are you an idiot?" she demanded. "Emil wouldn't dabble with magic beyond his pay grade, that's not him. You know that." Someone must have cursed him. There had been an odd look on Astrid's face for a moment after, as she had studied Hermione's face, and she'd excused herself soon after. But the rest of the school moved on. Students had whispered briefly, then lost interest. Emil had never been popular, never loud or impressive enough to command much attention at all. Then, one afternoon, as Hermione was keeping her head buried in a book, a common sight already, but increasingly common after Emil's infirmary stay, she had heard Peter Rehn laughing about it, his voice carrying easily between the library shelves. Oh, come on. Did he seriously think he could pull it off? Idiot got himself cursed probably just to impress that half-blood bitch. Peter, a quieter voice Conrad had chided. Don't be too loud. This is a library, not a slum house. Or what? He's going to rise from his infirmary bed and curse me silly. He'd just get himself cursed again. Snickers had again erupted from that table, and Hermione's hands had curled into fists at her sides as she rose from her chair, rage surging hot and righteous, and then she opened her mouth, and instead of words, a sob tore free. She fled the library in disgrace, tears blinding her, humiliation burning almost as fiercely as the guilt. After that, it became harder to tell when she was on the verge of crying and when she wasn't. The feeling lingered constantly now, tight and aching behind her eyes. She hid it beneath parchment and revision timetables, her exam preparation so meticulous it bordered on self-punishment. If she kept her mind occupied, perhaps it would not turn on her. But when she glanced up at her book, and he was not there, dead-eyed as he struggled to study, Hermione still noticed. When she glanced over at the empty seat next to her during every meal and lesson, Hermione noticed. When she was studying at his bedside and dared a look at his grey face, Hermione wished she couldn't notice. It was during one of those many days where Hermione read upon an armchair by his prone form, and Astrid was on the other, pale and quiet as she read too, when Emmeline's eyes fluttered open for a single moment. Is that? Astrid cut herself off, leaning forth. He opened his eyes. He didn't he, Hermione? Didn't he? Healer Frisk, Healer Frisk. A scream ripped out of him without warning. Emmeline's back arched violently off the bed, his body bowing like something strung too tight, fingers clawing uselessly at the sheets as pain seized him. Dark veins surged beneath his skin, standing out in stark, branching lines along his throat and temples, crawling down his arms as if something inside him were trying to escape. Astrid cried out his name and lurched forward, catching his hand just before it tore free of the mattress. His grip locked around her fingers with frightening strength. Healer Frisk, she screamed. He's hurting. But there was no need to call him once more, for Frisk was already there. He shoved Astrid gently but firmly aside just enough to gain space, one hand snapping out to press flat against Emmeline's sternum while the other dipped into the pouch at his waist. Fan, of course, Frisk muttered, eyes narrowing. Stay with me, boy. Don't you dare slip. He drew a jagged circle in the air above Emmeline's chest, sprinkling on reddish-green herbs. His wand moved like a blur then, and the herbs seemed to sink through the skin with a silvery glow. Hermione stumbled backward. She hit the edge of a nearby bed and barely felt it. The sight of Emmel thrashing and screaming as veins blackened like rot beneath skin was too much. Her hands flew to her mouth as a sob broke free, loud and helpless. I can't, she choked, shaking her head. Oh God, I can't, Emmel, oh God. Emmel screamed again, a raw, broken sound that seemed to tear straight through Hermione's chest. His eyes were open now, but unfocused, glassy with terror, rolling wildly as though he could see things none of them could. Astrid bent over him, tears streaming freely down her face as she squeezed his hand with both of hers. Emmel, it's me, she said desperately, voice shaking but loud. It's Astrid. You're in the infirmary. You're safe, do you hear me? You're safe. Stay with us, please, please. Frisk crushed something between his fingers and smeared the ash-like residue across Emmel's collarbone, drawing harsh symbols that pulsed faintly with sickly green light. He pressed their foreheads together briefly, murmuring incantations once again. Slowly, the worst of it passed. Emmel's trembling lessened, and Frisk withdrew, leaving the boy shaking and drenched in sweat. That's enough, he said quietly. For now. Astrid did not let go of Emmel's hand, knuckles white as though afraid he might vanish. Emmel's lashes fluttered again, slower this time, and when his eyes opened, they did not roll wildly. They fixed instead on nothing in particular. For one terrible moment, Hermione thought hoped that he might slip back under. At least unconsciousness would spare him this. And yet he stayed awake. A faint, strangled sound escaped his throat, and his fingers twitched weakly in Astrid's grasp. What he tried, swallowing hard, his jaw trembled. What happened? I just remember Hermione leaving. No one knows, Astrid said quietly, but she looked at Hermione for a long moment. Just that it's advanced dark magic. His throat worked. He swallowed, winced, and astonishingly let out something like a breathy huff of laughter that immediately turned into a hiss of pain. Dark magic, he croaked. Stars above. The idea of dark magic in Durmstrang unthinkable. Astrid made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and promptly burst into tears in earnest. You absolute idiot, she choked. You scared me half to death. Only half, murmured Emil weakly. Disappointing. Hermione took a step forward without quite deciding to. The world seemed oddly distant, muffled, as though she were underwater again. Emil, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't know we would have, that was a lie. She had known, and she still had done it. Emil's gaze, still dulled by pain, drifted to her. For a heartbeat, something like surprise crossed, well, he rasped, blinking at her. You look bad. Am I really the one who needs the infirmary? She squeezed her eyes shut, tears spilling freely now, hot and relentless. It was unbearable, this instinctive concern for her, when he lay there shattered because of what she had chosen. She had burned the papers and left him to scream alone. This was pain she herself had purchased. You need rest, Astrid cut in quickly, her voice tight as she shot Hermione a sharp look. You just woke up, don't strain yourself. Emil's gaze flicked back to Astrid, unfocused again. Feels like fire, he said faintly, his fingers curled weakly, searching for something solid. Like it's still inside. That's the dark magic, said Hermione, wiping her tears hurriedly. It'll be really painful for a long time, Frisk said. Dark magic is awfully hard to counter, Emil exhaled shakily. Knew it, he murmured, a ghost of his usual wryness flickering and then dying. Always hated surprises. After a moment, his eyes slid shut, lashes trembling, and before Hermione knew it, she was fleeing the infirmary, leaving him once again. The infirmary became, gradually and without ceremony, the center of Hermione's days. She came before breakfast, when the lights slanted pale and weak through the high windows and the beds were still hushed with sleep. Then, between lessons. Even in the evenings, she could be found tucked away in an armchair. Sometimes Astrid was there too, sometimes she was not. But Hermione was always there, no matter what. Slowly, Emil improved. He could hold a cup for a few moments without spilling it, and the dark veins had faded to faint shadows beneath his skin, but they never vanished entirely. When the pain came, though, it still left him gasping and writhing. It was on one of the better days, one of the days where he was upright, propped against pillows and scowling at a bowl of medicinal broth, that Hermione finally snapped. You're slouching, she said sharply, closing her book with a decisive thump. If you're going to sit up, then sit up properly. You'll make your back worse, Emil blinked at her. Good morning to you too. It's nearly noon. Time is an illusion, he said weakly, shifting anyway with a pained grunt. Pain is eternal, Hermione sniffed. Oh, don't be dramatic. You're doing much better today. I screamed for 15 minutes this morning. Honestly, sitting up, I feel like my grandmother, and I hate that woman. In fact, I hate all old people. Is it just me, or do they just fall for attention? Well, regardless, she said briskly. I was thinking exams. I've given you a bit of a break, but Emil, you really mustn't fall behind too much. He stared at her for a moment, then huffed out a short laugh that turned into a wince halfway through. You're unbelievable. Now, charms. You missed quite a few classes, and Mistress Merle will not care that you were cursed within an inch of your life if you can't explain the difference between a Schulz model and a Yang one. That's heartless, muttered Emil. Truly, cold as the North Sea. You're at Durmstrang, Hermione said. They won't even blink. Honestly, if anything, they'll be offended that you didn't die properly. So I'm expecting you to have read Chapter 8 of the textbook in its entirety and take the nifty little practice quiz I made for you before the end of today. Yet, despite her almost ferocious devotion to her studies, Hermione was not doing as well as she should have been. By anyone else's measure, she was still exceptional. Her name continued to sit comfortably at the top of most bi-weekly rankings. Professors still praised her work, and students still whispered. But Hermione herself had noticed the difference. Her thoughts no longer leapt. Where once she had threaded together disparate strands of magical theory into sudden, exhilarating clarity, now her reasoning trudged. She arrived at answers eventually, but without the familiar spark of delight, and that breathless moment where understanding burst, fully formed into her mind. The joy of discovery dulled, replaced by something heavier and slower. Casting, too, had become a chore. Spells emerged functional rather than elegant, not due to a lessening ability, but just out of lack of care. It took effort simply to raise her wand, focus, and care. After everything else, perfection seemed like an indulgence she could no longer afford. By the time she left Emil and reached natural magic, she was already tired. The greenhouse smelled of resin, a living scent that hung about each table. Specimens lined the desks, jars of preserved roots and winged insects pinned mid-flight, bowls of dark soil threaded with glowing fungi. Master Thalberg was, surprisingly enough, at his own desk, furiously going through papers with red ink. Oh, Hermione breathed, sitting next to Astrid. Was I late? I was visiting Emil. I must have lost track of time. Again, asked Astrid, who was flicking through her textbook aimlessly. Hermione flushed. Well, I'm not planning on making a habit out of it. It's just Emil needed company. He's so lonely there, don't you know? I know, Astrid said, still looking at her book. You're not the only one who cares, Hermione. It's just that I have more things to do than hang around his bedside all day. A sudden rush of anger took over Hermione, but she restrained herself from ranting. Who was she to lecture Astrid on friendship, after having done this to Emil in the first place? So instead, she said, why is there no work for us to do? Is this a self-study period? Astrid snorted. Thalberg's always busy near the end of year, she whispered, finally looking up. He's a bit like you, I think. He does too much work. Vogel makes Thalberg craft those nifty ritual guides, and he controls punishments, even though Capel is the deputy headmaster. Hell, the Loon's the sponsor of the Transfiguration team, Young Alchemists, the debate club, the list goes on. Somebody needs to find him a hobby. A man who does too much work, came Master Thalberg's voice, making both girls start, is usually a man trying not to think. Or a man who has thought far too much already and found no pleasant conclusions. He set the quill down at last and lifted his head, eyes narrowed beneath heavy brows. Neither condition is improved by leisure. Those nearby, who had heard Astrid's words, snickered. Astrid and Hermione, for their parts, nodded along rapidly despite their red faces. When Thalberg returned to his papers without another word, so did Hermione, and Astrid returned to their books too. But dueling was worse. Rommel had given his usual barking order, pair up, runce, and they had done so quickly. Hermione was happy when Iva went up to her. Iva was good, but Hermione was better, and yet today that was not so. Each duel ended the same way, Hermione reacting instead of commanding and hesitating instead of pressing, while Iva did not hold back. The worst part was that Iva kept an unnervingly blank face throughout. For once, Hermione found herself missing Conrad's stiff attempts at politeness. By the time class ended, Hermione's arms ached and her head throbbed dully, and the bell for lunch rang before she could even finish replaying her mistakes. Students streamed from the hall in knots, already whispering and giggling amongst each other. Hermione moved with them for a few paces, then veered sharply away to the infirmary, ascending the staircase. The doors to the infirmary were ajar, but Hermione heard Emil before she saw him. The scream tore through the corridor, raw and hoarse. It did not sound human so much as stripped off humanity. Pain boiled down to something animal and desperate. Hermione broke into a run, bags slipping from her arms as she rushed inside. Emil was in his bed, half-curled and fingers clawed white-knuckled into the sheets as though he might rip it free. His body was bowed sharply, and the dark veins, those cursed, crawling lines, had surged back with a vengeance. They stood out black and swollen beneath his skin, branching violently along his neck and jaw, disappearing beneath his gown as if something inside him were trying to tear its way out. He screamed again, and the others nearby recoiled instinctively at the awful sound. Even Healer Frisk, already moving, had a grim, tight expression as he barked orders and shoved a vial's contents down Emily's throat. For a moment, Hermione did not move. Every instinct in her body begged her to flee, to turn away, to escape the sound, the sight, the knowledge that this was her fault. Her legs trembled violently, and nausea roiled hot in her throat. And yet, as always, she forced herself forward until she was close enough to see the tears spilling freely down Emily's face, even as he screamed. "Here," she said hoarsely, though she was not sure he could hear her over his own pain. "Emil, I'm here." His eyes were open, wild and unfocused, glassy with terror. They slid over her without recognition at first. Another scream ripped from him, his body jerking violently as Frisk pressed both hands to his chest, murmuring incantations through clenched teeth. "Stay with me," Frisk snapped. "Breathe, boy, breathe." Slowly, agonizingly, slowly, the pain ebbed. The black veins receded, retreating back beneath Emil's skin like a tide drawn unwillingly away. His screams dwindled to hoarse sobs, then to broken, shuddering breaths. When Emil finally looked at her once more, he saw her, his face crumpled. His voice broke entirely. He dragged in a breath that hitched painfully halfway through, tears spilling anew. "I hate them," he choked. "I hate whoever did this. I hate them so much." Hermione felt the words sink straight into her chest, heavy and burning and large there, her vision blurred. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek, tasting blood, because she could not let herself cry now. Not here, not when he was looking at her like that, broken and furious and utterly unknowing. Emil pressed his fists uselessly against his eyes, shoulders shaking. "I didn't do anything." "I didn't. Why would someone?" Hermione stepped forward at last. She clasped her hands over his arms, squeezing softly. "It's not fair," she managed, her voice steady only by sheer force of will. "Oh, Emil, I don't know why anyone would do this. They must be cruel beyond belief." Just rest now. For the next few weeks, Hermione allowed herself what might have looked, from the outside, like a reprieve from studying. In truth, it was only a redirection. The meticulous book lists and revision drills were confined to smaller portions in her timetables, and in their place came something requiring even more effort, for the sadness she had worn like a shroud was shred. Rage, Hermione discovered, was wonderfully clarifying, especially when poured into research. It began, inevitably, with Capel, but she had already looked into him deeply, and there was little to find that was new. For a deputy headmaster, he left remarkably few traces. Annoyingly few, honestly. She was forced to branch outward, widening the net. If Capel would not yield his secrets directly, perhaps the shape of his world would. That was when she truly began scouring the library for more information on his friend, Karkaroff. Once again, that proved to be a bust. There was nothing of note she could find about him. She greatly wished to send an owl to the British Ministry of Magic to somehow obtain a copy of his trial record, but knew that would be foolish. When faced with that dead end, she moved on and combed through old staff lists, tracing which names recurred year after year alongside Capel's. Vogel and Thalberg, it seemed, were his oldest colleagues. She remembered what Varric had said about Capel. He was nothing without a friend. Vogel was, as always, disappointing and thoroughly dull. His publications were all quite pedestrian, and from the gossip she managed to wheedle out of Astrid, the most shocking thing about him was that he had a wife and 4 kids. Personally, Hermione felt if he had ever been dangerous, he had sanded himself down to something inoffensive long ago. Thalberg was a bit more interesting. His papers were numerous, but all dense and wandering into uncomfortable philosophical territory. He was an alchemist primarily, but seemed to be quite fascinated with human psychology. Of course, Hermione knew that alchemical transformations were just as much about the spiritual as the physical, but generally, she found herself always a bit more fascinated by the latter, the one with the actual magic involved. To her, someone so interested in humans themselves as well, At least that represented a motive to torture her alongside Capel, albeit a weak one. Once she'd exhausted all she could about Capel and his potential closest colleagues, Hermione turned her attention elsewhere, to Varric, the woman she suspected Capel was blackmailing just like her. There were academic records first. Varric, it turned out, had been an exceptional student, much like most Durmstrang professors. Her detentions were few and almost laughably mundane. One, Hermione noted, had been assigned by Master Thalberg for sneaking out after curfew. Then came the papers. Hermione nearly missed them at first, buried as they were in specialist journals, so obscure Hermione had never heard of them. They were agonizingly difficult. Treatises on curse inheritance, on the metaphysical scaffolding of lycanthropy, on necromantic animation. Hermione read with 3 supplementary texts open at once, cross-referencing terms, scribbling frantic marginalia, pausing every few paragraphs to recalibrate her understanding. With each note, she was trying to see Varric in a different light. The woman was obviously someone who was brilliant in a way that was truly rare, but also someone who viewed magic in a rather mechanistic, quite frankly unmagical manner. Her publications never really handled the moralistic nature inherent to magic, but Hermione supposed that made sense. Varric was a dark witch, after all. It was not in her own nature to concern herself too much with morality. But that didn't exactly fit her behavior with Hermione, did it? She had protected Hermione had warned the class against violencebi the time she found the family tree. It was next Friday, and the lamps in the archive burned low. The book itself was grim reading, lineages extinguished, or nearly so, during the Grindelwald ascendancy. Hermione traced her finger slowly down the page until she found the name. Varric. The family were Russian purebloods. According to the text, its members almost entirely slaughtered by Grindelwald's forces during his invasion of Novgorod. Momentarily, Hermione sat back slightly, surprised Varric was Ukrainian, she had heard. But immigration existed even in the wizarding world, like with Emil's family, once Hungarian, now Velstrian. Survival, Hermione was learning, often required flexibility. After being mostly finished with her background checks on her professors, upon reflection, she despaired at the thought of its necessity. Hermione mostly returned to her typical exam preparation. She was ahead of schedule anyhow, now having to scour the library on niche reading on the magic she knew after she got through all of the ones her professors had recommended. Still, when she had the time, Hermione was trying to find more about how Capel had spoken to her through her mind. It reminded her of the compulsion charms she herself had learned, but Capel had not compelled her to do anything, had he? No, he had communicated with her mentally. It reminded her a bit of how speaking with the Sorting Hat had been, how it had pondered over whether she was a good fit for Ravenclaw or Gryffindor most, while she begged to be sorted into the latter house. If only, Hermione thought with a touch of bitterness, I knew what I had been asking for. The most promising avenue she could find was a book simply titled Mind Magic. After furiously flipping through it for a while, she spotted a reference to something called legilimency, which was purported to allow a wizard to send qualia into a subject's mind and receive the feedback. Unfortunately, Hermione could find nothing about its actual theory or performance. It seemed to be a rather obscure art. Yet, almost as if the universe was conspiring against her, the bell for transfiguration rang while Hermione was still reading on. She left the book on the table, gathering her things and rushing to the classroom. Astrid caught her going near the back and crooked a finger at her without looking up from her bag. Sit with me, she said, rolling her eyes. We're friends, aren't we? Hermione hesitated, then slid into the bench beside her. Liv was on Astrid's other side, and when Hermione looked at her, she whispered something that made both her and Astrid stifle a laugh. Sophia leaned forward from the bench ahead, turning around just long enough to flash Hermione a bright grin. You ready for this? Asked Sophia. Luo's law nearly killed me. Oh, yes, Hermione said quietly, nodding. I put loads of effort into this paper. You always put loads of effort into your essays, Astrid sighed. There's more important things, you know. Like what? Astrid looked away that, suddenly busying herself with her bag once more. Sophia and Liv looked at each other and giggled more. Liv leaned past Astrid, smirking. Well, someone had their first kiss. It was very romantic, apparently. Lars had to go all the way, since he'd really hurt her the day before, because he'd gotten mad about her cancelling on him when he'd cancelled on her just before. So it was all a big mess, you see. After many moments of tuning out ceaseless prattle, Conrad arrived and took the seat to Hermione's right. He nodded at her, and Hermione forced a small smile. Then Capel swept in, and even false cheer could not withstand his presence. She thought of Emil in the hospital wing because of him, and had a sudden, wild urge to jump from her seat and wrap her hands around that neck. Watch him choke and sputter and spew. Homework, he drawled, gesturing lazily with his wand. To the front, if you will. Parchment slid forward down the rows. Hermione placed hers carefully atop the stack when it reached her. As always, her essay was both longer than strictly necessary and dense, with tightly packed lines of impossibly small script. Capel paused when he reached it. Well, he said mildly, ambitious. A few students snickered, and Hermione kept her gaze fixed on the grain of the desk. She did not feel humiliation, though. All she felt was anger. One day, she promised, she would give him his due. Whatever bit of dark magic he had used on Emil, perhaps she would learn and cast upon him. She could imagine his cries already. Miss Morgenstern, continued Capel, his eyes flicking over the parchment with irritating speed. One might suspect you believe Luo incapable of articulating his own theory without your assistance. I merely expanded on the derivation, Hermione gritted out, and drew a few connections to establish its place amongst other relevant principles. MM. Of course you did. He moved on, already losing interest, and Hermione exhaled through her nose. Today, Capel went on, we will be applying Luo's law of animistic persistence. Transform an iron seal to an echidna. You have 30 minutes. Begin. Seals appeared before each student with a twitch of his wand, and as she felt it, the iron was cold and heavy beneath Hermione's fingers. She did not reach for the textbook. She never did any more. The diagram already existed fully formed in her mind, and her wand moved almost without conscious thought. The seal softened and twisted and reknit itself. Slowly, spines erupted along its back, sharp and precise. Then a blunt snout formed, then claws too. The echidna shuddered once and came alive, small but stable, blinking owlishly at the world. Tiredly, Hermione sighed and hauled out a library book from her bulging bag to read. No one else was finished yet. Minutes later, Conrad's iron finally shifted. His transformation was slower, but when it completed, the difference was unmistakable. His echidna was larger, and its movements were fluid and confident, where Hermione's was merely functional. It snuffled experimentally, then curled in on itself with an almost content look. Hermione's, on the other hand, was still staring and blinking rapidly around. Conrad glanced sideways at her and smirked. Guess persistence likes commitment, he said lightly. Yours seems tired. Looks like it takes after its maker. Need a nap, Hermione. Heard you're visiting your friend in the infirmary quite a bit. Perhaps your dormitory's a better destination today. Irritation prickled under her skin, but Hermione's lips curved still. Perhaps yours takes after its maker too. How so? It's second place. At that, his smile widened. Soon enough, the bell rang and Capel ordered them all out. He vanished every echidna maid at once as the students packed their bags before. Miss Morgenstern, he added softly, come. The room emptied around her as she was forced to walk towards him, feeling her hatred grow with every step. She did not even wonder what he wanted from her any more. She just was so rageful that she was imagining his eventual punishment. Capel picked up her parchment again. This, he said, tapping it lightly, is brilliant. Hermione stiffened. You understand the theory at a level few do, he continued, almost reluctantly. Tell me, do you still follow textbooks for wand movements? Her jaw clenched. No, I thought not. He regarded her thoughtfully. Your understanding is far outstripping your practicals. Yaunothes instinctively, and yet you hold yourself back. I don't need your approval, sir, said Hermione sharply, nor your assessments, and I certainly don't need your concern. For a moment, Capel looked almost amused. Pity, he murmured. Hermione did not stay to hear another word. She gathered her things and left at a near stomp. She did not slow, her boots striking stone in a clipped rhythm. Hermione had just gone through the western doors when twilight began to creep over the castle, the light shining through the lofty windows, now a bruised purple and gold, as she ascended the familiar path toward the infirmary. She almost made it until, oi, Hermione froze for half a heartbeat, then kept walking. She knew that oily voice. It was Ren, and she had a good idea of what he wanted. But before she could turn the corner, there was a cry of "Defindo" and a loud ripping sound. At once, her bulging bag burst, her books and parchments and quills all spilling out onto the floor, and her ink pots crashing quite loudly. That was cause enough for her to whirl around, and she saw Ren. He stood a few paces away, hands tucked casually into his pockets and pale eyes bright with anticipation. But Hermione, despite her hands shaking with rage, fixed the mess with a simple repairing charm. Then, with another spell, her things all flew back into her bag, and her bag rose into the air for her to snatch it back. Oh, that was clever, said Hermione, clenching her jaw. I hadn't thought you would know the cutting charm. Finally learned it after 3 years here, did you? Ren's smile widened. Just checking in. You've been scarce, always running off. His gaze flicked pointedly down the path that led toward the infirmary. Visiting your little invalid again. Her fingers curled, and white-hot anger filled her once again. It was a common feeling nowadays, but she shoved it down, trying to hear over the rush of her own blood. He seems to scream a lot these days, Ren went on conversationally. Whole wing hears it. Makes studying difficult. Such a selfish one, that boy, isn't he? Shut up, Hermione gritted out. Just shut up, for God's sake, and for everyone else's too, you half-wit. Ren chuckled. Touchy. I suppose I'd be touchy if I were his friend too. Thank the stars I'm not. Enough, she said quietly. Leave, Ren. I don't want trouble. He stepped closer instead, his shadow stretching long and thin across the flagstones. You don't get to decide that, Morgenstern. Certain people, he leaned in, lowering his voice, shouldn't decide anything. The impure and the weak, for starters. Funny how they tend to pair off. Something within Hermione snapped, and she raised her wand, but Ren cried. Morsus. Motes of maroon magic formed from his wand tip, but Hermione was already completing its counter as he spoke. Before the flash of red could reach her, it sputtered out. Lacero, she said, and he whirled away while a white flash escaped from his wand, so she sidestepped his next spell. Before he could cast another, with a shout of Ventus, she forced the wind to obey her like a living thing. It slammed into Ren's chest and hurled him backward into the wall with bone-rattling force. He barely had time to recover before a second spell whipped past his ear, carving a smoking gouge into the stone where his head had been. He scrambled upright, panic bleeding into his expression now. You're mad. He fired wildly now, but Hermione deflected each and every one. She twisted her wrist, and yellow and purple and green jets all curved aside, dragged off course as though caught in a current. Every spell he knew, she knew too. At last, he growled out, Ossifragus. Fear flickered within Hermione for once, and she let out a shriek as she jumped out of the way. Locomotor, she cried, and the suit of armor Ren was hunkered near turned upon him. At once, it drew its great silver arm back and struck the stocky boy with a single blow. There was a sick crunching sound, and Ren crashed to the floor. His nose was bleeding scarlet freely. Stupefy. Ren's broken nose had made a wet mockery of the incantation, and the red light that should have burst forth instead guttered like a dying coal. It spat harmlessly against the stones at Hermione's feet and went out. For a heartbeat, they stared at one another. Then Hermione giggled. It startled even her, a short, sharp sound, almost bright. Ren tried to raise his wand once more, but with a flash of scarlet, it arced in the air before Hermione caught it delicately. Oh, she said softly, tilting her head. That's unfortunate. Slowly, she stepped closer, like someone approaching a caged animal, unafraid of being bitten. She felt horribly light, as though some terrible weight had lifted from her chest and left only clarity behind. Rehn spat blood and grinned anyway, crooked and ugly. "Still quick," he slurred. "Still showing off. Doesn't change what you are." Hermione crouched in front of him, robes brushing the ground. "You should really rest," she said pleasantly. "You look dreadful." He barked out a laugh that turned into a cough. "You worried about me now, or about him?" His eyes slid, gleaming, toward the infirmary wing. "Bet he's screaming again, still tucked in his nice warm bed while the rest of us do real work." Her vision narrowed. All she could see were dark veins crawling up her pale throat screams echoing off stone before she knew it. She'd already incanted Ossifragus. The hex struck true, and Rehn screamed, a raw animal howl as his leg twisted at an impossible angle, bones splintering beneath skin with a sound like snapping wood. He collapsed fully, convulsing, fingers clawing uselessly at the stones. Hermione flinched, looking away as if she herself had not done it. She stood at once, backing away. The rage that had carried her there ebbed all at once, leaving behind something cold and terrible. She turned to flee what she had done, but she saw an even worse sight there. Varric stood at the far end of the path, her dark eyes blazing with something dangerously close to fury. Varric moved fast. The suit of armor Hermione had animated now scooped Rehn into its silver arms and ran off to the infirmary with the stocky boy. Then the professor turned on Hermione. "What?" she said coldly. "Do you think you are doing?" Hermione did not lower her wand. Her hands shook now, and her voice too, as she replied, "He deserved it. He had me cornered. I was scaredy. I'd just been wanting to visit Emil, and he started taunting me. For a long moment, Varric simply looked at her. Then, with a sharp gesture, she roughly seized Hermione by the arm. "Come," she said. "My office." As she dragged Hermione there, Hermione's head raced, wondering what would happen. She assumed Varric's office was much like the woman herself, somehow both pleasant and unsettling, but Varric's office defied those expectations. It was tucked within a lesser-used wing on the third floor, shielded by layers of enchantments. Hermione could even feel prickle against her skin as they passed through. Inside, the room was warm, lit by a low, steady fire, which Hermione noted with faint surprise, for fire was against the rules. Bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with texts with titles in a variety of languages. A wide desk dominated the center, strewn not with student papers, but with maps, unmoving photographs, and brittle-looking parchments bound in twine. "Sit," Varric ordered, already walking to the other side of the desk. Yet Hermione did not. Instead, her eyes widened as she stared at Varric. Things had slid into place in her mind with not an elegant certainty, but an increasing suspicion. She smiled. Varric stiffened. "This is not amusing." "No," said Hermione. "But it ice and lightning." Varric's eyes narrowed. "Capel sent you to my parents," Hermione said slowly. "Not Vojanot Thalberg, who supposedly does all the things Capel is too lazy to dob at you." By this point, Varric had taken her seat already, but she remained silent. She just watched Hermione intently. "Because, like you said before, he needed someone who knew enough about Muggles to be convincing," Hermione went on. "Someone who could speak to them without giving herself away. Beautier family's pure-blooded, and you went to Durmstrang. I'll admit, I don't know much about wizarding Ukraine, but what I've heard from the students around Mate seems almost all of them consider Britain too soft on those with Muggle ties. So I doubt you learned much about them here, either while you were a student or a professor. What is the relevance of this, Miss Granger?" She flinched at the name slightly, but continued still. "You protected me from Capel's threats at the beginning. Even though Capel has something on you, something that he's using now to threaten you the same way he threatens me." Hermione stepped closer. "The Varrics were originally Russian and wiped out by Grindelwald, barring one branch. Convenient, isn't it? Because Russia's insular. Nobody here is from Russia. They have their own magical school, like Britain does. Nobody would know if you were Ling Nobody, but the man who had been handling admissions. Yet Varric did not flinch. If anything, her expression smoothed, furious disapproval cooling into something harder. She folded her hands atop the desk, regarding Hermione as one might regard a particularly ugly rat. "You are building a theory," said Varric. "An imaginative one. Students often do after they have done something unforgivable. Now, if I recall correctly, I told you toss it down. A theory I will research more into, no doubt. I wonder how much evidence I'll uncover then, Professor." Silence stretched. It was long and suffocating as they looked at each other. "What do you want?" asked Varric, tilting her head. She did not seem fearful at all. Still, Hermione smiled. "I want to do what I've always done, be able to go to a teacher for help, of course. And you will help me or else. Everyone will know what exactly you are. They'll know what you are too, you realize. Well, I know and I care. Obviously, Buteet's either that or spend 7 years tortured by that man, and perhaps even more if you're any evidence. I think I know what I'll do when it comes down to it." Varric leaned back in her chair at last, studying Hermione anew. There was faint surprise there now, and interest too. "You would weaponize that," Varric murmured. "Your own ruin." Hermione met her gaze without blinking. "You already taught me how. Conviction without adaptability is a weakness, remember." Chapter 18. Second Time's the Charm. It had been a long-held suspicion of Hermione's that the dormitory bathroom was enchanted specifically to annoy its inhabitants. The water which sprouted from the tap was always a tad too cold, and it was often the case that items placed in one shelf would suddenly jump to another. And the mirror, above all, seemed to take its suspected duty very seriously. "Oh, to stop that," it said sharply, as Hermione dragged the brush through her hair with more determination than sense. "You're only encouraging it. Look now, it's retaliating." Hermione hissed as the bristles caught in a knot the size of a snidget's nest. "I am not encouraging anything," she muttered, yanking the brush free and trying again. "I am attempting to achieve basic presentability." "Be quiet, why don't you?" Her reflection sniffed, but said nothing more. Many minutes of Hermione's furious yanking passed, her mind elsewhere even as her curls resisted heroically. Varric had not reacted in the way Hermione had hoped. No, she had simply sent Hermione away, seeming almost amused as she did so. That parting shot had irritated Hermione especially. "Never play your hand before it can be used properly," she had said, smiling. "Good luck on finding that evidence you speak of." Hermione scowled at her reflection and attacked again. By the time she finished, her hair, while still defiant, had been beaten into something marginally resembling order. It stuck out in all directions, yes, but with purpose now. And no matter its startling resemblance to the bristles of a well-used broomstick, Hermione was content with the result. "No," cried her reflection. "Please, do not shame yourself by going out like this. I beg of you. The other mirrors, they'll all tease me." She left the bathroom in a huff and emerged into the dormitory proper, where the light was thin and grey, and the air still held the sleepy chill of early morning. Iva stood by the armoire, her dark hair neatly plaited. She was spritzing perfume from a yellow blown-glass bottle that caught the morning light and fractured it into soft gold. She did not look up. "Good morning," said Hermione briskly, forcing cheer into the words as she strode to her own bed where Puck lay. He purred contentedly when he saw her. "Morning," Iva replied, equally brisk. There was a long moment of silence as Hermione alternated between petting Puck and shoving more books into her already bulging bag before. "Is it true?" asked Iva, her tone flat and almost incurious. "About Ren?" Hermione paused on shoving Ganima and Animusinto her book bag. "You really shouldn't listen to rumors so often," she said loftily. "They rot the mind." Iva finally glanced at her with an unreadable expression and gave a small, noncommittal hum, neither agreement nor denial, before capping her perfume and returning it to the armoire. Her roommate was not a talkative girl, she knew, and so, if even Iva knew about her confrontation with Ren, Hermione wondered, not for the first time, how many people were already whispering her name. A lot, it seemed. Not the entire school Durmstrang was far too practiced at violence for that, but the other third years talked, in low voices and sharp bursts, in corners of classrooms and along stairwells, in the pauses before lessons began. They talked while pretending not to look at her, and then looked anyway. But Hermione did her best not to care. She immersed herself instead in work. It felt criminal, honestly, that Luo's law should be taught without its corollaries, or that animistic persistence was discussed at all without reference to sympathetic decay. As exams loomed closer, she buried herself in more and more advanced, brittle-spined journals, chasing threads of theory that branched endlessly outward. Astrid, however, had decided without consultation that Hermione required updates. "It's still a topic," she announced one afternoon, sliding into the seat opposite Hermione with all the gravity of a messenger bearing war news. "Mostly in third year, though I've been trying to spread the story to the first and second years too, don't worry. It's a pity, though, that Lars said the fourth years don't really care at all. You'll have to do something much bigger next time, you do understand." I was thinking Fiendfire maybe, but anything sufficiently dark would work. The bone-breaking hex is just Sarjuvenal. Hermione did not look up from her scroll. "I don't recall asking." "I know you don't want this information," said Astrid cheerfully, "but Yauni Deadtoe know. Rehan's furious, by the way, like the vein on the forehead kind of furious. He keeps glaring at you like he's trying to set you on fire with his eyes." "If he is, that's his business," Hermione murmured, annotating a margin. And yet even Astrid's giddiness had been a mere shadow in comparison to Emil's sheer delight. He had been bedbound still when she visited, pale but lucid and propped against pillows that smelled faintly of many potions mixed. "Youted that," he'd croaked, and then he'd laughed, a sharp, wheezing sound that made Hermione panic briefly until it resolved into breathless cackling. "Tara's wand. I heard his sobs, but I didn't know you'd done it. I wish I'd seen his bone break. Ooh, did it poke out of his leg too? Please tell me it did. My curtains were drawn, so I didn't even get to see his pathetic little face." But his Screamsy never loved someone more than right now. Hermione had tried to look stern, failing in the process. It was awful, she knew, that Emil derived such joy from another's pain, but she could not begrudge him his enjoyment, not when she'd brought on his suffering. But spotlights, Hermione discovered, were fickle things. They burned hot, then wandered. The morning it shifted, Hermione noticed it not because anyone was watching her, but because so many people were suddenly not. She entered the great hall to a concentrated murmuring, the sound of many conversations bent inward. Heads were bowed across all tables, not in reverence but in reading. Newspapers lay spread open like great black and white wings. At the third-year table, Astrid was already there, sitting opposite, flanked by Liv and Sophia. Liv and Astrid shared one newspaper between them, shoulders nearly touching. Sophia had claimed another. Hermione slid into her seat, setting her bag down carefully. "What's happened?" she asked slowly, not even bothering to peer at the newspaper across her, for the Swedish words would no doubt just be gibberish to her. "Must be a lot, for you to be reading the paper." Astrid did not look up. "Oh," she said lightly, "just your homeland embarrassing itself again." Giggles escaped Liv and Sophia, and at once Hermione leaned forward, catching the headline of Sophia's newspaper. "The Wandering Wand, at last. Dumbledore removed as Hogwarts headmaster bellow." The headline was a picture of the man himself. He was tall and thin and wizened, his unusually bright blue eyes twinkling as he laughed. Hermione's stomach gave an odd, unpleasant lurch. Not because she particularly cared for the wizard himself, only the heavens knew how much she'd cursed his name for allowing that troll in on that Halloween night, but for fear of what awful happening had managed to occur under his watch. What happened?" she asked hurriedly, her hands already beginning to wring themselves. "Oh, I hope it wasn't too bad. For Professor Dumbledore himself to have been removed, it'd have to be something big, right, apparently," said Liv with much relish. "He failed to protect his Muggle-born students. Some dark wizard's been going around petrifying them. It's a shock, it is." If I had to choose between kicking out the most powerful wizard in Europe and a few Muggle-born swell, I think it's obvious what sacrifice I would make. Hermione's eyes narrowed. Hogwarts has never not accepted Muggle-borns. Perhaps this will encourage them to reconsider, shrugged Liv. A bit ironic, Dumbledore's always been a Muggle lover, and now he's been brought down because he's not enough of one. Fitting, isn't it? That's enough, Astrid cut in. Whatever else you think, sacking Dumbledore is disgraceful. Hogwarts wouldn't be anything without him. Hermione was glad that Astrid was defending the man, but she was not so sure about that argument. Well, that's not really true, is it? Astrid blinked. Excuse me. Hogwarts has produced dozens of important witches and wizards, said Hermione briskly. Jarlath Hobart invented the levitation charm, for one. And of course, everyone knows about Aurelie Gamp, of Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration fame. Merlin himself. You're just making names up now, aren't you? Sophia dissolved into laughter once more, but Hermione just bristled. I am not. Those are all really important figures, Astrid, and I've no doubt you'd know them if you read more. Regardless, Astrid went on, waving a dismissive hand, Dumbledore defeated Grindelwald. He deserves our unquestioning support just for that. I don't care if he's a Muggle lover, Muggle hater, whatever. Without him, all of us would be speaking German. We're speaking German, Liv, Sophia, and Hermione said at once. Astrid scowled. I meant at home, she snapped. Not just in school. Soon enough, summer was upon the fortress, and with it, exam season too. The days stretched and thinned until the long light arrived, and then the sun seemed to forget how to set at all. It shone through curfew and beyond, washing the battlements and towers in a pale, dreaming blue. Yet no student in Durmstrang got to enjoy this, for after but a few days of celebration, the library was packed from dawn until well after curfew, students revising with single-minded ferocity. Even the lofty windows, through which endless golden light flowed, offered no relief, only a reminder of everything they were missing. There was no reprieve to be had in their classes either, as instead of easing off, the professors pressed harder. Master Vogel introduced rituals of misfortune, his voice droning as he walked them through unlucky asymmetries, and the delicate art of ensuring catastrophe landed where intended. Thalberg, with his usual air of half-contained obsession, launched in towers above, so below, filling the board with mirrored diagrams and speaking at length about correspondences between celestial mechanics and the natural world. Worst of all, Capel and Varric had joined forces to teach transmogrification spells. Hermione spent most of those lessons glaring at one or the other as she practiced the sweat snake hex, snakes coiling all over her shuddering partner's form. Hermione's glares, in fact, were becoming something of a fixture. She snapped more readily than she used to, and when she was not glaring at a person, she was glaring at a book as though daring it to misbehave. Oh, but this doesn't make any sense at all, she muttered one afternoon as she read Gouging. An anthology. Kirchhoff's paper said the gouging spells tell us is privation. Since it's meant to create absent-sebut waffles, said that it's actually passage, that it's a spell of tunnels, wounds, channels, and mouths. So its success is measured solely by the property of throughness. Waffles' interpretation is still in accordance with the same models, I suppose, but still well, I suppose that both do have the fundamental similarity of both claiming the gouging spell fundamentally states thighs should not be here, but, ooh, that's just fascinating. Wonder how it intersects with the summoning charm. It seems sort of relational too, for heaven's sake. How didn't I notice that before? I might as well just break my wand. Hermione, Emil said from the infirmary bed. Emil sighed, shifting carefully against the pillows. You think very loudly. You know what'll also be very loud? Asked Hermione, narrowing her eyes. The sound of your sobs as they drag you out of Durmstrang for being the worst student ever. Her eyes narrowed more, but her lips twitched. She let out a haughty sort of scoff, before returning to reading, albeit silently. Before even a few moments had passed, though, Astrid strode in. She squealed, waving furiously. A stupid grin crawled its way across the boy's face, and he gave a weak wave back. Astrid pulled a chair closer and flopped into it with careless grace, propping her chin on her hands. "So," she said brightly, "how many days until Frisk lets you escape? I heard from a little birdie that you finally used a walker." "What?" Hermione burst out, closing her book. "Emil, you never told me this." "Oh, if I'd known, I'd have, well, not given you a break in exam preparation, but perhaps I'd have snuck you some sugar-free sweets in." The boy in question pinkened and wriggled under the sheet. "You guys," he groaned, "don't be so dramatic." "I looked like my grandmother while walking." "Comparing yourself to your grandmother?" asked Astrid. "Emil, don't be ridiculous. You're not half as ugly or cruel. It's like you said before, she just falls for attention." Emil sighed. "Obviously, she's incomparable to any human, but I'm approximating here." "Still, you're lucky, if you think about it," said Astrid thoughtfully. "At least the one on your father's side is dead. My grandmothers are both alive, and they're both nasty little bints. Probably runs in the bloodline, since they're related and all." Before Hermione could speak too, a slurred voice drifted from 2 beds down. "Prettiest," the voice said vaguely. "Most beautiful like moonlight, like a swan." Astrid blinked, then laughed. "Is he talking to me?" The patient in question, a sallow-looking fourth year with bandages wrapped about his temples, turned his unfocused gaze toward her and smiled beatifically. "An angel," he murmured. "A golden angel." Astrid laughed harder, hair falling into her eyes. Emil shot the boy a flat, murderous glare. "Oh, please," Emil grumbled. "At this point he's absolutely pretending to be addled by entrancement enchantments just to hit on girls. And he'll Frisk too, for some reason." The boy sighed dreamily. "Cruel world," he whispered. "It's a cruel world in which you are not mine." "Well, then he's definitely healed," said Astrid, looking mightily pleased. "Cognition's clearly intact. No signs of mental decay, and he displays sharp acuity, if anything. How is he not discharged yet?" "He should have been released by yesterday. He called me a vision of beauty and grace a day ago," sighed Hermione. Astrid's smile vanished. "Oh," she said softly. I didn't mean to make light of it. I didn't realize enchantments could it bad." Hermione's fingers tightened around the edge of her book. For one alarming moment, she imagined launching herself across the room. But before she could, Emil cleared his throat and hurriedly said, Talking about enchantment, Hermione, I caught a glimpse of your bag." He peered at it, narrowing his eyes. "If you're so stressed over exams, why's there fourth-year textbooks in it?" "Fourth year," Astrid repeated, her eyebrows raising. "Fourth-year textbooks, fourth year," said Emil, nodding solemnly. "There's a traitor within our ranks, and it's the captain herself." Hermione spluttered. "I am not a traitor." She drew herself up then. "It's only the charms and history coursebooks, and they're hardly a priority. Really, I've even forgotten about them. I've never touched them during study blocks proper. Never. They're just for a bit of light reading." Astrid gaped at her. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that after a full day of studying, you relax by reading next year's textbooks?" "Really?" "Yes," Hermione said defensively. "After endless papers written by theoreticians who assume you already know everything. It's actually rather soothing to read something terribly basic. No footnotes arguing with other footnotes. No grand metaphysical claims, just simple, clear facts that require no effort at all to understand. I read them before bed sometimes to unwind from all the stress." Emil pressed a hand to his chest. "Listen to that," he whispered in mock horror. "All this time I thought you were forged of pure academic iron, and now you tell me you're relax." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Hermione snapped. "You'd do the same if you could read." "I can read," said Emil indignantly. "I simply choose not to out of principle. You, on the other hand, were someone I thought had principles too." "Oh, don't be dramatic." "He will be exactly as dramatic as this betrayal demands," said Astrid. "Fourth-year texts, Hermione. What's next? Rhyming mnemonics, coloring books." Emil let out a long, theatrical lament, sinking deeper into his pillows. "This is what becomes of the greats," he moaned. "They tire, they grow weak. They seek comfort." Astrid laughed, and Hermione argued, but for a little while it was simply pleasant. The weight of exams and whispered threats seemed to lift, and it was just the three of them together. But of course, this indulgence did not last be the following afternoon. Hermione was sat hunched over a wide oak library table, surrounded by higgledy-piggledy stacks of books that threatened collapse with every sharp movement of her quill. An absurdly long and dense treatise, the asymptotic rigidity of animistic lattice forms in transfigurative rings of being across tertiary, quaternary, and quinary morphic states. A wizard's approximation was the subject of her notes for now. But nearby, volumes on magical cognition too lay open beside compendiums of spellcraft. Although Hermione wished to focus entirely on her upcoming exams, the search for more about legilimency and perhaps something to counter it proved to be almost as irresistible as it was fruitless. Nevertheless, Hermione was justifying it to herself. The more of mind magic she learned, after all, the more she understood the mind-altering spells that could be covered on the exams, from the cheering charm to compulsion curses. It was no different, really, to how she delved far too deeply into every other topic discussed in class was halfway through a proof, in very small script, showing the conservation of morphic discomfort, which stated that increased existential unease in the transfigured object allowed lesser casting effort, generalized the second animistic law when a shadow fell across the page. Hermione looked up sharply, only to see that Conrad stood at the end of the table. His hands were folded neatly behind his back, and his posture was as rigid as ever. He inclined his head in greeting. "Hermione," he said, "may I?" "May you what?" "Speak with you, of course." At once, her eyes flicked past him. Rehan was lingering several shelves away, pretending very badly to browse. His gaze met hers, sharp and ugly with promise, and Hermione's hand lowered to her robe pocket. But then he turned away with a sneer and walked out of sight between the stacks. "Well," said Hermione, trying for a smile, "you already are, aren't you? Go on all you want, then." He smiled faintly. "You placed second in dueling warfare," he said. "Congratulations, it was well earned." The words were polite and sounded sincere enough, but that more than anything unsettled her. "Thank you," Hermione replied slowly. "I haven't been checking the rankings, so I didn't know. Still, I wouldn't have expected you to care. Did you really come over here just for that?" Conrad's thin lips twitched, as if he found the question amusing. His gaze drifted quite openly to the literature piled around her. His brows lifted despite himself. "There's never a sole reason why anyone does anything," he said, shrugging. Hermione restrained an eye roll or a scoff at his pretentiousness. But it would be strange not to acknowledge a classmate's success, no. "No," Hermione said, a bit snappishly now. "I really didn't need your acknowledgement, but I thank you for it nevertheless, of course," she added belatedly. "So how are you feeling about exams?" "I'm awfully nervous myself. The feeling is mutual, although I'd wager mine is much more well-founded." He smiled and leaned closer, eyes skimming titles with growing interest. Then he straightened again, and she could feel the question forming before he spoke. "May I ask you something?" she sighed. "Once again, you already are." "Why?" he asked, evenly. "Do you look as though you expect me to hex you at any moment?" Hermione raised her eyebrows. "Because I broke your friend's leg, obviously. He deserved it, mind you, but I doubt you see it that way." Silence settled between them, and Conrad considered her for a long moment. She wished to match his gaze, but instead looked away. There was no purpose in instigating a fight she could not win. Only then did he step away, still smiling. "You didn't force Peter to provoke someone stronger than himself." An odd feeling rose in Hermione, shock. Her mouth fell open despite herself. "That's it, really. I brutalized your friend, Conrad. You don't think I was cruel?" Conrad supplied. "Excessive, perhaps, but that is not a crime, is it? You showed who was stronger. Now Peter knows who not to target." "That's," she began, then stopped, breath catching. "That's a terrible way of thinking. You can't honestly think it's acceptable to target anyone just because they're weaker." "I never said I held that belief, but Peter does." "Thou share all your beliefs with your friends." At once, Emil's face flashed across her eyes. Emil, who believed utterly in blood and inheritance and the quiet, righteous ordering of the world. And what of even Astrid? Hermione knew well that she did not need ideology at all to be cruel. Hermione opened her mouth to argue, to insist, to defend something she suddenly could not quite articulate, but no words came. Conrad, for his part, seemed to have lost interest in this line of conversation, his gaze drifting once more to the edge of her book stack. Mind magic, he said suddenly. An interesting direction. Oh, it really is, she said quickly, glad for the reprieve. Goodness, the theory behind all of it is simply delightful. I just want to understand it all properly, you know. Confundus, entrancement, cognitive interference. You need to know the foundations, the workings of the mind itself, to properly master any of it. I don't like not knowing what's actually happening. Conrad smiled then, looking curious. A noble goal. But he continued, almost apologetic in tone, but with quirked lips, you may find that the truly advanced work will elude you, even here. He glanced around the towering shelves of the Durmstrang library. Some knowledge is not published. It is inherited and guarded. Quite unfair. He did not look very displeased at this inequity, Hermione noticed. In fact, his smile had widened whilst saying that, if anything. Conrad inclined his head once more. Good luck, Hermione. Then he turned and walked away, leaving, and before he was even gone from her sight, Hermione was back to furiously reading. Still, Conrad's taunt, had it been a taunt, she honestly couldn't tell, had gotten under her skin. Hermione planned to keep her blood status secret for at least 4 more years. She could not risk someone gaining access to her mind, could she? The last week of May was a time of much dread for most students, but none more so than Hermione. She'd been forced to take a calming draught at least twice in the days before their first theoretical exam charms was to take place. But by the time she set her quill down, Hermione had not merely answered the questions, but expanded them, weaving in advanced theories, counterexamples, and elegant clarifications that gently exposed the exam's necessary oversimplifications. The rest of her written papers, still held in that uncomfortably hot dueling hall, went similarly well, although that did not stop Hermione from worrying about them in the aftermath. Hermione, Emil had sighed, after the 5th time she compared their transfiguration answers. If I didn't know you so well, I'd have thought you were trying to humiliate me. As it is, I still want to throttle you. On Friday, the dark arts practical arrived. Hermione had known, abstractly, that it was coming after all. She had revised for it with the same obsessive thoroughness she applied to everything else, striving to master every hex and curse to an entirely unnecessary high level. She'd practiced entrancing until she could compel many at once, had mastered the wind-tie hex to the point of those currents accruing enough strength to snap transfigured Steeland yet. When she woke that morning, the knowledge settled in her stomach like a stone. The fortress felt different that day, quieter but not calm, like the hush before something struck. Third years clustered in knots along the corridors, ashen-faced as they whispered amongst each other. Even Astrid, usually irrepressible, was subdued, twisting her necklace until Hermione was worried it might snap. Hermione felt oddly removed from it all, as though she were watching herself from several steps away. Time did strange things. One moment she was reciting Benoit's theorems under her breath in transfiguration. The next, she was shoving her quill into her bag as the bell rang for midday. Lunch passed in a haze as she anxiously told everyone around her about how the spiders produced by her tarantula tear spell really looked more like wolf spiders. For some reason, they all seemed quite irritated by this. Then, as soon as the bell rang, Varric was upon them. Third years, she said crisply, her voice cutting through the great hall's din. With me. Chairs scraped back, and the third years all shot up. For a few moments, they scrambled to find their positions, before silently marching in a single file to the great doors of the entrance hall, which groaned open as warm summer air rushed in to meet them. Varric led them out of the fortress and down toward the grounds beyond, her stride steady and unhurried. Hermione's palms were damp around her wand, and she did not look for anyone in particular as she followed. She kept her eyes on the floor, counting her steps as she poured all her focus on breathing properly. Oh God, she thought desperately, I'm going to fail. I'm going to fail, and it'll all be my fault. I'll be kicked out of Durmstrang on my own merits, or lack thereof, and that'll be that. It'll have all been for nothing. Halfway through the downward path, Hermione gasped, and her hands flew to her hair. She had forgotten to put it into a plate. Oh, of course, she muttered under her breath, furiously beginning to do so. Of course, I forgot the simplest thing, of course. You never enter a dangerous situation with your hair down, never. Unless you have really short hair, maybe I ought to get a haircut, if I keep being so forgetful. Once she had finished doing that, she'd bitten her lip and applied a sticking charm to tightly pack her already braided hair into a bun. It was perhaps needless. She doubted any obstacle in the exam would go for the hair first in a fight. But it calmed her enough not to worry any more until they had reached the ring of blackened stone that marked the foot of the cliff. Varric turned. Listen carefully, she said, her mouth curved upwards. This practice is not a duel. There will be no single opponent, no fixed sequence of spells to deploy. You will not be told what you are facing in advance. Someone near the back made a small, choking sound. Hermione herself felt very much like doing the same. This, Varric continued with pleasantness unbefitting the circumstances, is a test of will, skill, and speed in that order. She raised her wand, and dozens of pins spilled upward, floating as though caught in an invisible current. They were narrow and darkly polished, each one engraved with a pair of initials that glinted as they turned. Hermione felt a sharp jolt of recognition when she saw her own HM. The pins drifted outward slowly until one hovered before each student, hovering precisely where their hearts would be. A portkey, Hermione thought anxiously. These pins, said Varric, will transport you to different sections of the mountain. No two paths are the same, although I have tried my best to ensure equality in the level of difficulty, I assure you all. Despite the professor's words, unease still reigned supreme over the group. Hermione saw Astrid shivering slightly despite the warmth, and nearby, Ivan Petrov looked quite green. Still, Conrad and Rehen seemed unbothered, the former's face blank and the latter's lit up with eagerness. The first thing you will do upon arrival, Varric said, her tone sharpening, is fasten your pin to your robes immediately. Do not cast another spell, nor take another step, for there are charms embedded in the metal. They will record your difficulties. She paused. This allows us to evaluate not only whether you succeeded, Butho. Her eyes flicked briefly to Hermione. I borrowed the concept from a former student. Hermione kept her face blank, though irritation prickled behind her eyes. Failure to attach the pin, Varric finished, will be considered failure to participate. You will be retrieved eventually. Take your pins and good luck. In a blur of motion, Hermione seized the cool metal, and at once the pull hit, terrible and disorienting, as though she were being dragged through herself. Her stomach lurched, her ears rang. For a terrifying fraction of a second, there was nothing at all, then stone slammed beneath her boots. She staggered, wind knocked clean out of her, arms pinwheeling as loose gravel skidded underfoot. She only just managed to keep her balance, stopping short of a sharp drop that plunged away down the mountainside. Still, after only a moment of terror, Hermione had never liked heights very much. She forced herself to look ahead. A narrow ledge had been carved into the mountainside, no wider than a classroom aisle, and stretched away into mist. At its mouth stood a solid wall of ice, translucent and faintly blue, and a chalk line had been scraped into the frozen rock before it. The starting line, of course. After hurriedly attaching the pin to her crimson robe, Hermione drew her wand and cried, "Defodio!" But no hole appeared in the thick ice. She gritted her teeth in frustration. It was enchanted. Given that this was a dark arts exam, Raz, she hissed now, Capel's face swimming in her mind's eyes before silvery flames leapt onto the ice. The flames did not roar so much as bloom, pale and vicious, crawling across the frozen wall like living things. The ice melted, weeping rivulets that steamed where they struck stone, the surface sloughing away in sheets, water cascading down the ledge in a sudden surge. Freezing water exploded forward, and Hermione barely had time to scream before it slammed into her chest and tore her feet from the stone. Cold swallowed her whole, knife-sharp and breath-stealing, and she tumbled end over end, robes twisting around her legs, wand clenched desperately in her fist as the wave hurled her along the mountainside, panic clawing up her throat now. Her head broke water, and she gasped desperately for air even as she was still dragged forth towards a stony end. Scappa! The water beneath her surged obediently, swelling and folding in on itself, and Hermione was flung upward as if by an invisible hand. The wave smashed into a broad stone shelf with a thunderous crash, and she landed hard atop it, skidding on her knees and palms, soaked through and shaking, but alive. She stood, panting for a moment, and with a muttered incantation, a blazing heat blasted through her, drying her soaked robes. Yet she did not have time to be grateful, for only a moment passed before the mountain groaned. At first, she thought it was another echo of the water, reverberating through the stone, but then the shelf shuddered beneath her, and the cliff face ahead of her began to move. Rocks wrenched themselves free with sharp, grinding shrieks, tearing out of the mountainside as if summoned by some vast, unseen will. They rolled, cracked, and then rose. Arms split from slabs of granite, faceless heads heaved upward, and stone warriors thus lurched into being, their bodies still shedding pebbles as they turned toward her in jerky unison. Hermione's breath hitched. For one horrible heartbeat, she simply stared. Then the nearest construct charged. Oh no, 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 panic fizzed through her veins, hot and paralyzing, but instinct slammed through it just as fast. Hermione spun, pointing her wand downward. The water was still there, roaring below the shelf, and with another shriek of scappa, it answered her again, wrenching itself upward. The wave rose in a gleaming arc, casting them all in shadow, then crashed forward at her command. Stone warriors were lifted clean from the ground, limbs flailing uselessly as the water swept them along the ledge just as mercilessly as it had swept her. Glacius. Frost raced across the wave in a heartbeat, locking it solid in the space of a breath. The rocky sculptures were frozen within it and trapped in grotesque, half-struggling poses. Hermione followed through without mercy, slashing her wand downward. Fractus. Ice shattered, and stone burst apart with it, raining shards and dust down the mountainside in a deafening cascade. Hermione staggered back, chest heaving, heart hammering so hard it hurt. She wiped water from her eyes with a trembling sleeve. Then she began running once more. Her lungs burned, and so did her legs, but she did not stop. Minutes passed, and the path narrowed again, winding cruelly along the cliff face before spilling out into a sloping stretch of broken ground. Waiting there were wolves, thick-furred, massive, eyes bright, and intelligent in a way that made her stomach drop. There were too many. 5, no, 6. They spread out instinctively, cutting off escape routes with terrifying ease. Hermione's breath hitched and she stumbled, trying to slow herself before she reached them, but they apparently had no such reservations. One lunged. She shrieked and backed up so quickly she fell. The wolf, growling and baring its teeth, slowly prowled forth while Hermione was frozen in terror. What could she do? The answer appeared almost immediately. It was but a simple-minded creature-any mind-altering spell they'd learned should work feeling terror. Hermione still began to wave her wand about as she whispered an incantation of great complexity. She hoped it would work. She had never tried entrancing multiple things at once. They were clearly compelled already, but Hermione did not wish to undo the existing spell, only to twist it and turn their aggression upon themselves instead. The enchantment finished, and their wolves' eyes glazed and their snarls faltered. For a breathless second, nothing happened then, just as she'd wished. They turned on one another. Snapping jaws and flying fur filled the air as the pack collapsed into chaos. Hermione did not wait to see how it ended. She fled, heart pounding, legs screaming as she ran uphill. She ran and ran and ran until the ground dropped away entirely. She skidded to a halt. Before her yawned a sheer gap, too wide to jump and too deep to look down, without throwing up at least. The wind tore across it in fierce gusts, howling horribly. Hermione's stomach lurched. She did not like heights. She swallowed hard, toes curling inside her boots. "I can do this," she whispered, though her knees trembled. "I have veto." "Oh, I can't fail, it'll all have been for nothing, Ventus." The wind caught her. It wrapped around her, tentative at first, then stronger, lifting her boots from the stone. Hermione squeezed her eyes shut and let go. She flew, but it was nothing like it had been on a broom. There was no balance, only empty air and raw force. Hermione screamed the entire way as she was yanked forward, robes snapping wildly, the ground dropping away beneath her until the mountain seemed a distant, unreal thing. The crossing was agony, every instinct screaming at her to cling, to look down, to fall, but the wind held, steady and relentless, until her feet struck solid ground once more. She gasped when she could finally stand properly, and dark shapes streaked past her. Birds, dozens of them, spiraled out of the clouds, beaks sharp, wings tucked as they dove straight for her. Hermione fumbled for her wand, panic surging againwhoosh. Something enormous tore through the flock, and there was a sickening crack, a spray of blood, feathers bursting apart in the air like torn parchment. Bodies fell, tumbling past her in broken arcs. Hermione froze, terror locking her throat so tightly she could not even scream. Slowly, she followed the path of the impact upward. A massive shadow loomed out of the mist. A hand, huge, gray, and knotted with muscle, gripped a crude wooden club, now slick with red and feathers. Above it rose a hulking shape, shoulders scraping the rock, breath steaming in the cold air. A mountain troll stared down at her, small eyes narrowing with interest. Hermione's heart seemed to forget how to beat. For a moment, the mountain, the wind, the birds, everything fell away, replaced by a memory so sharp it hurt. A foul, cavernous, stench scrape of stonier club, descending she saw it as she had in her dreams, and felt that same certainty, cold and absolute, that she was about to die. Her fingers went numb around her wand, and the troll lifted its club. She could not move. Her feet felt rooted to the rock, her lungs locked tight as the past rushed up and wrapped around her throat. She was a first year again, waiting for death. But then, scree, a single bird, late and wild-eyed, shrieked as it raked its talons across Hermione's cheek. Pain flared, and the spell broke. Hermione gasped, staggering back. "A pugno!" The bird wheeled at once and hurled itself at the troll's face, beak snapping viciously at its eyes, but the troll roared, swatting clumsily, and crushed it. Feathers drifted down slowly, and Hermione let out a whimper. "No, no, no, please, Ossifragus." The hex struck the troll squarely in the thigh and rebounded as if she had thrown a pebble at a fortress wall, ricocheting uselessly into the mist. The troll laughed a wet, rumbling sound and swung. Hermione ran, ducking beneath the club as it smashed stone to powder and sprinted straight between the troll's legs, heart hammering so hard she was surprised it had not burst. She did not look back, but could hear it behind her, its gait fast and wrong somehow. This was no lumbering brute. It was tall and thin for its kind, limbs too long and movements unnervingly quick, and it was gaining on her. "You are not 12, she told herself fiercely. "You are not trapped in a bathroom. You are not helpless." She skidded to a halt, spun, and raised her wand, and the mountain answered her, rock surging and reshaping itself at her command, jagged outgrowths flowing and refining in an instant. She did not think in steps or diagrams, not consciously. Shek knew how this worked, felt the logic of it slotting together as naturally as breath. Capel had been right. She had never allowed herself to trust her own ability, but she did now. Sheknush could do this. Stone became feathers and beaks and talons. Then at once, eagles tore free of the cliff face and hurled themselves at the troll's head, screaming as they went for its eyes. They clawed and bit, and blood flew in all directions as they tore into them. The troll bellowed in agony, swinging its club wildly. One blow struck the rock beside Hermione, and the force of it blasted her clean off her feet. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs. Her wand flew from her grasp, skidding across the stone. No, the troll staggered forth, still swatting at the attacking birds. If it could see, it was barely its eyes were gorged so horribly, Hermione held back vomit. Still she scrambled, fingers scraping painfully over grit as she lunged for her wand. When she seized it, the troll seemed to hear and it lunged, but with a shouted spell, wind screamed into being, spiraling around the troll in a violent vortex. Dust, feathers, and loose stone all whipped upward as the creature was lifted bodily from the ground, trapped in a howling cocoon of air. It flailed helplessly, its club spinning uselessly in its grip. Hermione held the spell for one heartbeat longer, then cut it. The troll slammed into the rock face with a thunderous crash and collapsed in a groaning heap. But it was undeterred, already beginning to push itself up, shaking its head before raising the club once more. It roared, moving toward her with shocking speed, but Hermione merely flicked her wand. The club vanished from the troll's hands and reappeared directly behind its own head, mid-swing. With a dull crack, the blow landed and the troll fell, shaking the ground beneath her. Its head crashed only a foot away from Hermione, and the force was so great, she stumbled, clutching onto the mountain face for balance. For a moment, she stood there shaking, panting, and staring. Then she laughed once, breathless and disbelieving, before clamping a hand over her mouth. She had done it. Still, despite the odd joy filling her, she did not linger. Hermione turned and ran, legs aching, lungs rasping, the path narrowing and twisting ahead as though it meant to trip her one last time. Then, abruptly, the ledge widened. At its center stood a low pedestal of black rock, utterly plain save for what rested upon it. A single, scuffed leather boot, upright and absurd, as though someone had abandoned it there by accident. Hermione stared at it for half a heartbeat, incredulous. That's the end, she thought. Could have made it a bit more grand, after all of Thisbut, before she could mentally critique it too much. A rattle of bone interrupted her. Skeletons, half a dozen of them all clutching rusted weapons in skeletal hands, advanced without haste. Hermione did not slow. Ossifragus, the first skeleton, collapsed in a scatter of limbs, femur snapping clean through. She looked about as she ran still, wand snapping from target to target with ruthless precision. Ossifragus, Ossifragus, Ossifragus. Bones shattered mid-stride, ribcage bursting apart, spines twisted and falling in on themselves like broken ladders. The skeletons never reached her. They simply came undone, reduced to heaps of inert bone across the stone. Still sprinting, Hermione jumped over the last of the remains before grabbing the boot. It burned hot then, and the world blurred around her before she stumbled forward, gasping. The squat black castle that was Durmstrang rose before her, but nearer was Mistress Varric, who was looking at her with much surprise. There was a small number of students already there. "Miss Morgenstern," she said slowly, raising her eyebrows. "Finally back, are you? You took quite the time with your exam. I wish you well on the theoretical portion, because suffice it to say, you are not going to be placing very high on the practical." Horror filled Hermione. "No, no, Professor, please," she said hurriedly, ripping off her pin and handing it over at once. "It was an awfully difficult exam. I did my best. Please don't mark me harshly. Please, I tried so hard. I did everything right. Oh, you can't do this." Varric looked at her pityingly. "How can I not, Miss Morgenstern? You arrived well after I expected, given your ability." But Hermione lowered her voice, even as she was fidgeting with her hands to calm herself. "You know how cruel it was, what you did. Putting a troll when you know what happened to me." Varric's expression changed at once. "A troll," she repeated sharply. The word cut clean through Hermione's babbling. She looked up, breath hitching, and saw something very unlike pity cross the professor's face, astonishment first, then a hard anger. "There was no troll assigned to any section," said Varric. "Describe it, please." Hermione swallowed. "It was very strange," she said hoarsely. "Very thin and very fast." I thought you knew. Varric said nothing for a long moment. Her jaw tightened. Her gaze flicked, briefly, toward the fortress rising above them. When she looked back at Hermione, whatever she saw there seemed to settle something unpleasant in her mind. Go, said Varric curtly. Get to your dormitory. We will discuss this later. Feeling a bit confused, she hurried back inside the fortress. But then, as she walked through the corridors, tight, silent fury took over her. Capel. Of course it had been him. The troll had been yet another message. Her hands shook as she climbed the stairs, anger burning so hot it left no room for fear nor befuddlement. But as the rage cooled, thought crept back in. What had Capel done to create such an odd troll? Perhaps transfiguration, she muttered absent-mindedly. But not transfiguration couldn't make such a creaturate, had magical resistance, like any other troll. Transfiguration can grant powers, like strength and speed, or even wings or extra limbs or such, but not that. Certain Lido transform something to have special magical traits. That's transmutation, that's alchemy. Her step faltered. Puck had been made by transmutation, as all troll cats were. And where had she found him? In the mountains, because she and Astrid had been sent there to get a Gleiphotes for natural magic class. She hadn't questioned it at the time, but that was far too far out for a simple errand, wasn't it? Her breath came fast now, the pieces sliding together with sickening ease. Thalberg, who was a long-time colleague of Capel, and Capel would do anything for a friend. Thalberg, who was suddenly impossibly busy at the end of term, while Capel, who should have been busy processing Durmstrang applications, seemed unaffected. Thalberg, whose duties already overlapped so neatly with the ones Capel never seemed to touch. Oh God, Hermione breathed out. Capel wasn't doing admissions. He never had been. He had, as with many other of his roles, been delegating. Thalberg had been the one to see her application toe paint it red, yet except her still Hermione reached her dormitory in a daze and collapsed onto her bed, Puck scrambling up at once to curl against her chest. The room dimmed around the edges as another memory surfaced unbidden, unwelcome. You walked through the fire, the voice had whispered in the cave. You saw what you would do for magic. You recognized your weakness, and you chose to cut it away. Those words stirred something within her, not anger nor sadness, but recognition. Thalberg had taught them all about it, and she'd read more on her own. Those were the first 4 of the 7 stages. Calcination, the first, was the fire that burned away whatever was unnecessary and reduced a substance to its base essence. Then dissolution came, allowing that substance to forget its history through its ashes diffusing through water and be imbued with a new meaning. So it's like emotional cleansing, Astrid had asked many months ago. Letting go, a shiver rippled through Hermione, but she forced herself to think still. She held Puck tighter, her fingers carding through his black fur for comfort. What the next steps represented were obvious. Separation and conjunction, knowing oneself and keeping only the elements necessary. And after that voice in the cave had spoken of her past, it had made her let Emil get harmed to prove her dedication to Durmstrang, to magic. Fermentation matter decaying so the final product could be made, deep darkness necessary before the light comes. Then Thalberg had sent the troll. What had he said of distillation? Purification, clarified through trial. It was, she knew, the final purge before enlightenment, when everything changed, when bitter became sweet, but distillation was only the 6th stage, wasn't it? There was a 7th, conjunction. The thought settled over her like a cold hand. Hermione's arms tightened around Puck without her quite realizing it, her grip almost bruising as her mind raced ahead, imagining what sort of ending Thalberg might be preparing, what dreadful symmetry he would consider complete. The cat merely purred, warm and solid against her, utterly content. He pressed his blunt little head beneath her chin, and despite everything, Hermione felt her mouth curve into a small, tired smile. All right, she murmured, reaching for his brush. Just once before bedtime. But Puck went rigid. There was no warning, no growl, no hiss. One moment he was a bundle of fur and comfort, and the next his claws sank deep into her arm. Hermione cried out, pain bursting bright and blinding, her fingers spasming again, the world went dark.